Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never been comfortable sharing this, but after 2 decades, I think I need to get this off my chest. I've been living with this secret too long. It started in the early 90s. I was driving home late from my shift at the hospital in Harrison County, just outside Corridon. The road was dark as pitch, one of those county roads where the trees make a tunnel overhead and the only light comes from your headlights. I rounded a curve doing about 45, and that's when my lights caught it. Standing at the edge of the road was something. At first my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear. But we don't have bears that size around here. This thing was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it stood at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in this thick, reddish-brown hair, and when my headlights hit it, it raised one arm to shield its face from the light. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3 seconds before I sped past, but I'll never forget how solid it looked. This wasn't some skinny guy in a costume. Whatever it was had mass. I'd guess between 600 and 800 pounds. The shoulders were impossibly broad. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white and drove straight home. I didn't tell anyone except my husband, who assumed I was just overtired from the night shift. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a weird shadow or my mind playing tricks. You know how you rationalize things that don't fit into your understanding of the world? That's what I did. Fast forward several years. My husband and I purchased 119 acres of wooded property in Dubois County. It was our dream, building a home on our own land, having space for our horses, room for the kids to explore. At first, everything was perfect. Then the weird stuff started happening. My mom was staying with us for a while, helping with the kids while we got settled. One day, she was tidying up around the trailer we were living in while our house was being built. She'd been throwing small rocks away from the porch that the kids had collected. Nothing special, just ordinary rocks. She'd tossed them about 20 feet into the brush. Later that afternoon, she came inside looking puzzled. "Did you see anyone out there?" she asked. I hadn't. Why? "Those rocks I was throwing away. They're back on the porch." I figured neighborhood kids were playing a prank, but we were pretty isolated. Our nearest neighbor was over half a mile away. Then came the thumps. At night, we'd hear these solid thumps against the trailer walls, not like a branch brushing against it, but like something deliberately hitting the side. Thump, then silence for 10 minutes. Thump, another side of the trailer. One night, my mom let the dogs out before bed. We had 3, a German Shepherd, a Lab Mix, and a small terrier. They all started barking furiously at something in the woods. Mom said she heard this deep voice, not quite human, but definitely not an animal, make a sound, and all 3 dogs immediately went silent and bolted back to the house. She said they were terrified, tails tucked, trembling. When she told me the next morning, I remembered that thing on the road years earlier. After my husband retired, he spent more time on the property, clearing brush, maintaining the trails through our woods. One evening, he came in looking shaken. He'd been working near our barn when he spotted something large, moving through the trees about 100 yards away. He said it wasn't moving like a person or a deer. It was covering ground unnaturally fast, but on 2 legs. We started paying more attention. I began finding tracks after heavy rains. Huge impressions in the mud, easily 15 inches long. The stride length between them was ridiculous, sometimes over 5 feet apart. Some of the tracks led into thickets so dense and thorny that no human would willingly push through them. I didn't want to believe it. I mean, who would? We're talking about something that's not supposed to exist. Then came the night that changed everything for me. It was early October, unseasonably warm. My husband had gotten one of those night vision monoculars for his birthday. Not the military-grade stuff, but decent enough to see movement in the dark. We were sitting on our porch around 9 at night, enjoying the quiet. All 3 dogs were inside, which was unusual. They normally loved being outside with us. My husband was scanning the tree line with his new toy when he suddenly went rigid. "Don't move," he whispered. "There's something out there." He handed me the scope, his hand trembling slightly. I raised it to my eye and had to stifle a scream. About 70 yards from our porch, partially hidden behind a large oak, was a figure. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with a massive frame. The shoulders were impossibly wide, and its arms, God, its arms hung down past its knees. The head looked almost pointed at the top, and even through the greenish glow of the night vision, I could make out that same reddish-brown hair I'd seen years before. It was watching us, just watching, not moving, barely seeming to breathe. As we were both frozen, staring at this thing, something hit our carport roof with a loud crack. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It sounded like someone had thrown a baseball-sized rock onto the metal roof. When I looked back through the scope, the figure was gone, just gone. No movement, no sound of retreat. Something that big should have made noise moving through the underbrush, but there was nothing. My husband and I sat in silence for a long time before going inside, locking every door and window. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we found a rock on the ground near the carport. It wasn't from our property, wrong type of stone entirely, and it was sitting in the middle of a clear area where it couldn't have just fallen from somewhere. After that night, things escalated. We'd hear wood knocks, 3 distinct knocks, then silence, then 3 more from a different direction. Sometimes we'd hear whistles that sounded almost human, but not quite right. The pitch was off somehow, too deep, too resonant. One morning, I found a half-eaten deer carcass about 30 yards into our woods. Its legs had been broken in ways that didn't make sense for a normal predator. The spine had been snapped cleanly, and large chunks of meat had been torn away, not cut, torn. My husband installed trail cameras. Most nights, nothing. But occasionally, they'd be turned to face the trees or the ground. Once, a camera that had been secured 8 feet up a tree trunk was found 20 yards away, the mounting bracket snapped clean off. The most disturbing incident happened last summer. I was alone on the property. My husband had taken the kids to visit his sister for the weekend. I was in the barn, feeding the horses around dusk. All 3 animals were agitated, nickering and moving nervously in their stalls. I heard a sound from the hayloft above me, a shuffling, like something heavy moving across the wooden floor. Then a deep, rumbling breath. Not a human breath, it was too deep, too large. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The horses went completely silent, which terrified me more than their earlier nervousness. Then came a smell, like wet dog, musty leaves and something musky I can't describe. The air felt thick with it. I backed toward the barn door, moving as quietly as I could. I never looked up at the loft. I was too afraid of what I might see. Just as I reached the door, something heavy shifted above me, and hay dust filtered down through the wooden slats of the loft floor. I ran to the house, locked myself in, and called my husband. He drove home that night, arriving around 2 in the morning. We searched the barn together the next day, but found nothing except some strange hair caught on a splintered beam in the loft. Coarse, reddish-brown hair that neither of us could identify. We had it analyzed by a friend who works in a lab. Unofficially, of course. He said it wasn't human, wasn't from any common livestock or pet, and wasn't from any known wildlife in our region. I've shown the hair to exactly 3 people since then. One laughed it off. One suggested we contact a university. The third person, an old-timer who's lived in these hills his whole life, just nodded slowly and said, "Now you know. We're still here on our property. We've learned to coexist with whatever it is. We don't go into certain parts of our woods anymore. We come inside before dark. We never, ever venture out alone at night. Sometimes, on summer evenings, We'll hear wood knocks or strange calls from deep in the trees. Once in a while, we'll find gifts left on our porch, unusual stones, a perfectly arranged pile of berries, once even a beautiful turkey feather fan that no human hands could have crafted. I don't know what to call what lives in our woods. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, those names seem almost disrespectful now. All I know is that it's real, it's intelligent, and for whatever reason, it's chosen to share its territory with us. I've never told this story publicly before. I'm not looking to convince anyone. I know what I've seen, what I've heard, what I've smelled. 20 years ago, I would have laughed at someone telling this same story. I don't laugh anymore. Story 2. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night last February. I'd worked a double shift that day, Thursday, February 6th, 2020. Nothing particularly unusual about the day itself. Just your typical law enforcement grind in northwest Georgia. I've been with the department for almost 11 years now, and you get used to seeing some strange stuff, but nothing prepared me for what happened on our drive home. My wife, Jen, and I had driven to Fort Payne, Alabama to meet her sister for a late dinner. It was just something casual we'd planned a few days before. We live in Rising Fawn, Georgia, right off Cave Springs Road near Highway 11. It's a quiet area. Mostly woods, a few scattered houses, and not much else. The kind of place where you know your neighbors, but might go weeks without actually seeing them. We were heading back around 11 p.m. in our old 2003 Toyota Camry. It's not fancy, but it's reliable. 130,000 miles and still running strong. The heater was blasting because it was one of those cold February nights where the temperature drops into the low 30s. The kind that makes you pull your jacket closer to your body. Highway 11 is pretty isolated at that time of night, just a 2-lane road cutting through dense forest with hardly any streetlights. You mostly rely on your headlights to see anything beyond 20 feet. We were cruising at about 55, maybe a little faster. Jen was nodding off in the passenger seat, and I was focused on the road, fighting my own tiredness after that long shift. That's when I first noticed the movement. It caught my eye coming from a drainage ditch on the passenger side, maybe 20 or 25 feet ahead of us. At first, I thought it was a deer. We get them all the time around here, and I've had more near misses than I can count. But then this thing rose up from the ditch. I still struggle to process what I saw. This wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or since. The way it moved was what struck me first. It didn't dash across the road like a panicked animal. It literally rose up and stepped onto the shoulder with this deliberate, controlled motion, almost methodical. By the time our car reached that spot, the thing had stopped right on the white line at the edge of the road. I'll never forget the moment we drove past it. Its head was level with our car's roofline, maybe even a bit higher. Our Camry is about 5 feet tall, so do the math. And its chest, God, its chest filled the entire passenger window. Jen was asleep, thank goodness, or she would have been eye to eye with this thing barely 2 feet away through the glass. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I was sure we were going to hit it or that it would hit us. The thing was literally inches from the side of our car. I could almost feel the car being pulled toward it, like when you pass a semi on the highway and get that vacuum effect. The creature had no visible neck that I could see, just this massive head sitting directly on broad shoulders. Its arms hung straight down at its sides, unnaturally long and thick. The biceps on this thing were huge, like the size of a 5-gallon bucket, no exaggeration. I've been around some bodybuilders in my time, guys who dedicate their lives to getting big, and this thing made them look like children. The whole encounter lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I caught enough details to know this wasn't someone in a costume or some optical illusion. The hair covering its body was this light grayish-white color with darker patches, brown or black, especially around the shoulders and upper back. It wasn't uniform like a costume would be. It had natural variations, like an animal's coat. Based on how it compared to my car, I'd put it at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and it wasn't just tall, it was proportionately built. Wide, dense, with this sense of mass to it that's hard to describe. You could just feel the weight and power of this thing as we passed. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. Some primal part of my brain took over, and all I could think was, keep driving. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth went completely dry. What's wrong? Jen had woken up from my sudden tension. She must have felt me jerk or gasp. Nothing, I lied. Just almost missed our turn. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. Not right then. How do you tell someone you just saw something impossible? The next 10 minutes driving home were the longest of my life. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see this thing following us or standing in the middle of the road. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel with both of them just to keep steady. When we got home, I made a show of checking all the doors and windows before bed. Told Jen it was just routine. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over in my head, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a bear, a really big bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't stand like that, not so steady and controlled. They don't have that kind of mass in their upper body, and they certainly don't stand 8+ feet tall. I drove back to that spot the following day in broad daylight. Part of me was looking for evidence, broken branches, footprints, anything. Part of me was just trying to rationalize what I'd seen. There was nothing unusual there, just the same drainage ditch, the same shoulder, the same strip of asphalt. I finally told Jen about it 3 days later. She thought I was joking at first, then got concerned when she realized I was serious. She suggested stress, fatigue, maybe my eyes playing tricks in the darkness. All the rational explanations I'd already run through 100 times myself. I considered filing a report, but stopped myself. What would I even say? I saw Bigfoot on Highway 11. As a law enforcement officer, I know exactly how that would go over. I'd be the laughing stock of the department. People would be making jokes about Sasquatch ride-alongs for years. So I kept it mostly to myself, only mentioning it to a couple close friends who wouldn't immediately think I was losing my mind. One of them, Mike, told me there have been other sightings in that general area over the years. Nothing officially documented, just stories passed around by locals. People who saw something in the woods they couldn't explain and were too embarrassed to report it. It's been 8 months now, and I still can't drive that stretch of Highway 11 without feeling my heart rate spike. Every time I pass that drainage ditch, I slow down a little and scan the tree line. I find myself checking the rearview mirror more often when I'm in that area, especially at night. The thing that gets me most, that I can't reconcile, is the purposefulness of it. This wasn't a random animal crossing, the way it stopped at the edge of the road and just watched us pass. Like it wanted to be seen, like it was assessing us. There was intelligence there, awareness. I've responded to hundreds of calls involving wildlife in my career. I've seen bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once. Animals have patterns, predictable behaviors. They either run from humans or, if threatened, display certain postures. This thing didn't do either. It moved with intention. It positioned itself precisely where we would pass by. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stopped. What would have happened? Would it have approached the car, attacked, just disappeared back into the woods? But then I think about those arms, that mass, and I know I made the right call continuing on. I've measured my car a dozen times since that night, 5 feet from ground to roof, which means this thing's eyes were at least 7 feet off the ground. Its shoulder width was broader than our car doors are tall. The proportions just don't make sense for any known animal. Last month, I finally worked up the courage to go back to that spot in the daytime and really explore the area. The ditch runs about 6 feet deep at that point. The tree line starts about 30 feet from the road's edge. Whatever this thing was, it could cover that distance in just a few strides. There are no houses nearby. No places where someone could have been waiting to pull a prank. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, an exhausted mind seeing things that weren't there. But I know what I saw was real. I just don't know what it was. Sometimes when I'm patrolling that area now, I catch myself scanning the tree line more carefully, looking for movement, for something that doesn't belong. I keep a spotlight in my patrol car now that I didn't carry before, and I avoid taking Highway 11 at night when I can help it. I don't know what's out there in those woods. I don't know if it's still there or if it was just passing through. But I know what I saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered in all my years in this region. And the worst part is knowing that while I drove away from it that night, it's still out there somewhere, moving through those woods with purpose, with intelligence, watching, waiting. Maybe for another chance encounter like the one we had. Every time I drive past that spot now, I can't help but wonder, is it watching me again? Story 3. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 8 months now. It's taken me this long to even consider writing it down, and honestly, I'm still not sure I want to share it publicly. But I need to tell someone who might understand, and after lurking here for a while, this seems like the place. I'm a wildlife biologist, specializing in forest ecosystem dynamics. I've spent 16 years in the field, studying everything from timber wolves in Minnesota to black bears in the Appalachians. What I encountered last October doesn't fit into any scientific framework I've been trained in, and it's shaken me professionally and personally. I was doing a solo assessment of riparian habitat health along Black Creek, about 40 miles from the nearest town in northern Washington state. It was unseasonably warm for October, around 65 degrees, with that golden autumn light filtering through the canopy. The forest there is incredibly dense, old-growth cedar and Douglas fir towering overhead, with thick undergrowth that makes movement difficult off-trail. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was crouched near the creek, documenting some unusual erosion patterns and collecting water samples. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Birds were calling, small mammals were rustling in the brush, the normal background symphony of a healthy forest ecosystem. I remember standing up to stretch my back when I felt it. Not heard it, felt it. A strange pressure change, like when a storm front moves in rapidly, but localized and intense. The birds went silent first, then the small rustling sounds. I've experienced this phenomenon before, when large predators move through an area, what we call a ripple effect in the wildlife community. But this was more pronounced than anything I'd felt with bears or mountain lions. I instinctively reached for my bear spray, scanning the opposite bank where the sensation seemed to originate. The creek at that point was only about 8 feet across, shallow enough to wade through if necessary. The undergrowth on the other side was particularly thick, salmonberry bushes, devil's club, and young western hemlock saplings forming an almost impenetrable wall of vegetation. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the slight movement of branches in the light breeze. Then the movement pattern changed. It wasn't random or wind-driven anymore, but deliberate. Something large was pushing through the brush toward the creek. My first thought was black bear. We have plenty in the region, and they frequently follow waterways. I stood perfectly still, hand on my spray, watching the brush. Then the movement stopped, and that's when I saw it. About 20 feet away, partially obscured by foliage but clearly visible, stood something that simply shouldn't exist. I'm trained to estimate size and weight of wildlife accurately. It's part of my job. What I was looking at stood approximately 10 to 10.5 feet tall, not hunched over like a bear on its hind legs, but fully upright with a posture that was unmistakably bipedal and almost human-like. Based on its proportions and apparent density, I'd estimate its weight at around 1,100 pounds. The creature was covered in hair, not matted or shaggy as I'd always imagined from Bigfoot stories, but relatively neat, short, dark brown hair with distinct grey patches throughout. particularly around what I'd call the shoulders and upper chest. It gave the impression of being well-groomed, almost dignified in a way that completely contradicted what I'd expected from folklore. Its face is what I remember most vividly. It was simultaneously gorilla-like, yet distinctly not a gorilla. The eyes were deeply set and dark. I couldn't distinguish pupils from iris at that distance, but they conveyed an unmistakable awareness. The skull shape reminded me of Neanderthal reconstructions I've seen in museums, a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed those eyes, giving them a deeply recessed appearance. The nose was small but not entirely flat, with wide nostrils that seemed to flare slightly as it breathed. The mouth had full lips, set in what I can only describe as a neutral expression, neither threatening nor friendly. Most striking was a square, jutting chin that gave the face a distinctly hominid rather than ape-like appearance. There was something about the face that conveyed age, not decrepitude, but experience, like looking at an elderly indigenous tracker who's spent decades in the wilderness. There was depth there, a quality I've never seen in any other animal. We stood looking at each other for what must have been only 15 or 20 seconds, but felt like an eternity. I was terrified, but also experiencing a strange sense of privilege. My scientific mind was desperately trying to catalogue details while my primitive brain was screaming at me to run. What happened next was even more extraordinary. The creature took 2 deliberate steps forward, emerging more fully from the brush. Its movements were fluid and controlled, nothing like the awkward lumbering portrayed in those infamous film clips you see online. Its proportions were massive, but anatomically consistent. Long arms that hung below its knees, broad shoulders, a barrel chest tapering to relatively narrower hips. The legs were thick and powerful, clearly evolved for navigating difficult terrain. As it moved forward, it raised one arm to about chest height, palm outward, a gesture that seemed unmistakably intentional. I've spent enough time observing primates to recognize a dominance display when I see one. But this wasn't aggressive. It felt more like a boundary being established. Throughout the entire encounter, there was almost no sound, no vocalization, no heavy breathing, just the minimal noise of vegetation being displaced as it moved. And strangely, I detected no odor whatsoever. Given my downwind position and the creature's size, I should have detected something, but there was nothing, contrary to nearly every Bigfoot account I've ever heard. My training kicked in at this point. With any potentially dangerous wildlife encounter, sudden movements can trigger predatory responses. I began slowly backing away, maintaining eye contact but trying to appear non-threatening. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I focused on controlling my movements. The creature remained stationary as I retreated, simply watching. It made no attempt to follow or to communicate further. After I'd backed up about 30 feet, I allowed myself to glance behind to make sure my path was clear. When I looked back, and I swear this only took a second, it was gone. No sound of crashing through brush, no glimpse of movement. It had vanished with a stealth that defied its enormous size. I continued backing away for another 100 yards before finally turning and making my way rapidly back to my research vehicle, about a mile downstream. I didn't run. Running triggers chase instincts in predators, but I moved as quickly as safety allowed, constantly scanning my surroundings. When I reached my truck, I sat there shaking for nearly an hour, trying to process what I'd seen. I'm a scientist. I deal in observable facts, repeatable phenomena, and peer-reviewed evidence. What I'd just experienced existed outside that framework entirely. I took out my field journal and tried to document everything while it was fresh, drawing what I'd seen with shaking hands. Looking at those sketches now, they fail entirely to capture the presence of the being I encountered. I've spent the months since then researching everything I can find on Sasquatch encounters, comparing accounts to what I experienced. Some elements align with other reports, the height, the general appearance, but other aspects of my encounter seem unique, particularly the groomed appearance and the lack of odor. The most significant aspect to me was the intelligence I perceived. This wasn't just an animal reacting to a human intruder. The creature's actions appeared purposeful and considered. The hand gesture especially seemed communicative in nature, not stay away or I'll attack, but more like this is my territory, respect that boundary. I've told no one about this encounter professionally. In wildlife biology, claiming to have seen a Sasquatch would be career suicide. I'd become that crazy Bigfoot guy overnight. The scientific community has little tolerance for observations that can't be substantiated with physical evidence, and I had none to offer. I returned to the site 3 times in the following weeks, setting up trail cameras and collecting environmental DNA samples from the area. The cameras captured nothing unusual, and the eDNA results showed only known local species. Whatever I encountered left no trace that current scientific methods could detect. 8 months later, I still wake up sometimes with that face vividly in my mind. Those eyes conveyed something I've never seen in any other species, a sentience, an awareness that felt almost like looking at another form of human. Not human as we know ourselves, but something parallel, something that evolved alongside us, but took a different path. I don't know what I encountered that day. I can't reconcile it with my scientific training, yet I can't deny what I saw either. It was real. It was there. And it knew I was there too. The encounter has changed how I view the forests I work in. They seem deeper now, more mysterious. I find myself scanning the tree line more often, listening more intently to the sounds of the wilderness, not out of fear, but out of awareness that there may be more present in these ancient ecosystems than science has yet documented. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told me this story, but I know what I saw, and whatever it was establishing boundaries rather than threatening me, showing intelligence and purpose in its actions. I was the intruder in its territory, not the other way around. And sometimes, in my more philosophical moments, I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the deep forest, living a parallel existence that only occasionally intersects with our own. Story 4. I've never shared this with anyone outside my immediate family. Even telling them felt ridiculous, and I could see the skepticism in their eyes. But what happened to me last July changed how I view the wilderness forever. I know what I saw. I've been fishing the tributaries of the Caddo River system in northern Louisiana my whole life. My grandfather taught me, and I've probably spent more time on those waters than anywhere else. That particular day, July 16th, 2017, was sweltering, even by Louisiana standards. The humidity was so thick you could practically drink the air. I'd taken a Thursday off work to get some peace and quiet. My construction job had been stressful, and I needed to clear my head. Dawn fishing has always been my therapy. Nothing beats the stillness of morning on the water, watching mist rise off the surface as the sun breaks through the cypress trees. I arrived at my usual spot around 5:30 in the morning. The location is pretty remote, about 40 minutes down a dirt access road, then a half-mile hike through dense forest to reach this particular bend in the river. Not many people know about it, which is precisely why I like it. Cell service is spotty at best, but that's part of the appeal. It's just you and nature. The fishing was unusually slow that morning. I'd caught a couple small bass, but nothing worth keeping. Around 9, I decided to move downstream to a deeper pool I knew about, maybe 300 yards away. The path follows the riverbank through thick vegetation, lots of saw palmetto, cypress knees, and swamp maples creating a dense canopy overhead. I remember pausing to wipe sweat from my eyes when I first reached the pool. The water was darker here, almost black in the deepest part, with fallen trees creating natural structure where bigger fish tend to hide. I'd just started setting up when I heard a splash from across the river. Now, splashes are common. Could be anything from a jumping fish to a water snake to a falling branch. But this was different. It was substantial, like something large entering the water. My first thought was maybe a deer coming to drink, so I froze and watched quietly. What emerged from the water wasn't a deer. About 100 yards away, on the opposite bank, something massive pulled itself out of the river. At first, all I could see was a dark shape, and my brain tried to make it into something familiar. A bear, maybe, though bears are pretty uncommon in this specific area. But as it fully emerged and stood upright, I realized I was looking at something impossible. It stood at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human: shoulders too broad, arms too long, hanging down almost to its knees. Its entire body was covered in reddish-brown hair, dark and slick from the water. The hair wasn't uniform, longer around the shoulders and upper back, shorter on the limbs. The coloration wasn't uniform either, darker along the back with lighter patches on what I'd call its chest. The creature moved with surprising grace for something so large. It walked upright, completely bipedal, with a steady gait that seemed almost casual. Water cascaded off its body as it emerged fully onto the bank. I remember noticing how its feet pressed deep into the mud, much deeper than a human's would. I was completely frozen. My fishing rod was still in my hand, but I couldn't move, couldn't even think about moving. I just stood there, partially hidden by a cypress trunk, watching this impossible thing exist in broad daylight. The most unnerving part was how it never looked my way. It had to know I was there. I was downwind, but not exactly hidden, yet it acted like I didn't exist, like I wasn't worth acknowledging. There was something deeply unsettling about that, more than if it had charged at me or showed aggression. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 5 minutes, I watched it walk along the opposite bank. Its gait was steady but not stiff, sort of a rolling motion, fluid in a way that's hard to describe. Its arms swung slightly as it walked, not dramatically but noticeably. Then it simply turned and entered the tree line, disappearing into the dense forest beyond. When it was gone, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking. The fishing rod I'd been clutching had left impressions in my palm from gripping it so tightly. I stood there for another 20 minutes, afraid to move, afraid it would come back, afraid that moving might somehow attract its attention. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of water flowing and my own ragged breathing. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to pack up my gear. Every movement felt loud and dangerous. I kept looking across the river, expecting to see it watching me from between the trees. The hike back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every shadow looked like a massive figure. Every rustling sound made me freeze in place. I made it back to my vehicle and sat there with the doors locked for another half hour, trying to process what I'd seen. My hands were still shaking when I put the key in the ignition. I told myself all the usual things. It was a bear walking on its hind legs. It was another hiker in strange clothes. It was a product of heat exhaustion and my imagination. None of those explanations fit. What I saw moved like nothing I've ever encountered. It had a presence that was undeniably real and overwhelmingly powerful. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to go back. I needed evidence, tracks, hair, something to prove to myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. So I returned the next day, this time bringing my phone with its camera ready and a small measuring tape. The spot where I'd seen the creature emerge was accessible by crossing at a shallow point about a quarter-mile upstream. It took me most of the morning to work up the courage to cross over. The bank where it had emerged was soft mud mixed with sand, perfect for tracking. There were deer tracks, raccoon prints, even what looked like wild hog marks. But what I was looking for, massive humanoid footprints, weren't there. At least nothing I could definitively say belonged to what I'd seen. There were some disturbed areas, places where the mud had been displaced, but nothing clear enough to photograph or measure. I spent hours searching the area, looking for broken branches, hair caught on thorns, anything. I found nothing conclusive. The forest had already reclaimed any evidence, if there had been any to begin with. On the drive home, I started questioning my own experience. Had I actually seen what I thought I saw? Was my mind playing tricks? But the image was so vivid, so detailed. The way water had dripped from its body, the subtle variations in its hair color, the depth of its footprints in the mud, the absolute silence of the forest during and after its appearance. These weren't the kind of details imagination typically provides. When I got home, I started researching. Turns out, the waterways in northern Louisiana and neighboring northeast Texas have a long history of Bigfoot sightings. Local indigenous tribes have stories going back generations about forest people or wild men. Hunters and fishermen in the area have reported similar encounters, always near water, always brief, the creature usually indifferent to human presence. I've never told this story publicly before today. I've gone back to that fishing spot many times since then, part of me hoping to see it again, part of me terrified of exactly that. I've never had another encounter, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm in those woods now. The logical part of my brain still searches for explanations. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered primate. Maybe it was a human with a medical condition causing excessive hair growth and unusual proportions. Maybe it was something else entirely. But deep down, I know what I saw that day doesn't fit into our understanding of what exists in North American forests. I still fish those waters. I still love the outdoors. But now I understand why our ancestors feared the deep woods. There are things out there that defy explanation. Things that remind us we don't know everything about this world. And sometimes those things emerge from the water on an ordinary July morning, walk past without a glance, and vanish back into the mystery of the wilderness. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw. And I know that whenever I'm near water in those forests now, I'm not just watching for fish. I'm scanning the opposite bank, wondering if I'll ever see that massive hair-covered figure emerge again, and wondering what might happen if next time it decides to acknowledge my presence. Story 5. I never believed in any of that Bigfoot nonsense until October of 2012. Now, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. My husband Jake and I have owned our little farm outside Ozone, Arkansas for about 7 years. It's nothing fancy, just 20 acres with a modest house, a couple of outbuildings, and some hay fields. We've got chickens, 2 milk cows, and 3 dogs, Rusty, Bella, and Duke. The dogs are basically our children. They're spoiled rotten and sleep in the house most nights. That night started like any other fall evening on the farm. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because we were watching some reality show that only aired on Tuesdays. The air had that crisp October feel, and we'd been enjoying the cool weather after the brutal summer we'd had. Jake had just poured us both a glass of wine when the dogs went absolutely berserk. Now our dogs bark. That's normal. They bark at deer, at the neighbor's truck passing by, at squirrels, you name it. But this was different. This was frantic, almost panicked barking that made the hair on my arm stand up. Duke, our German Shepherd mix, was at the back door, growling like I'd never heard before. Rusty and Bella joined in, and they all seemed fixated on something outside. Probably just a coyote, Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. The barking continued for maybe 2 minutes, getting more and more intense, and then nothing. Complete silence. That was way more unsettling than the barking. I got up to check on them and found all 3 dogs had retreated to their dog houses on the back porch. They were whimpering, tails tucked between their legs. These are farm dogs that have chased off bears and stood their ground against packs of coyotes. I've never seen them scared of anything. "Jake," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something's wrong with the dogs." He came up behind me, peering through the back door window. What the hell? Why'd they stop barking? I don't know, but they're terrified of something. We have a big security light that illuminates most of the backyard, but it only comes on when something triggers the motion sensor. Right then it was dark, except for the dim glow from our kitchen spilling out the window. I'm going to see what's out there, Jake said, reaching for the porch light switch. I grabbed his arm. Maybe we should just stay inside. He gave me that look husbands give wives when they think we're being silly. Emma, it's probably just a coyote or something. The dogs will chase it off once they realize we're out there. I let him go, but my stomach was in knots. Jake flipped the switch for the outdoor light and opened the door. The dogs didn't move from their houses, which was bizarre. Normally they'd be out the door in a flash if we opened it. We stepped onto the porch, and that's when we saw it. About 80 feet away, near the old mineral feeder we use for the cows, was something. At first it was crouched down low, and I thought maybe it was a bear digging through the remnants of the mineral block. But then it stood up. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget watching it rise. It just kept going up and up until it was easily 7 or 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its shoulders were impossibly broad and thick, like a football player wearing massive pads, but this was all flesh and muscle. No pads, no costume. When it turned its head toward us, I saw its eyes catch the porch light, 2 yellowish-green orbs that reflected like a cat's eyes in the dark. They were set deep in a face I couldn't make out clearly, but I could tell it was looking right at us. Its arm. God, its arm. It hung down way too far, with the hand dangling near its knee. No human has arms that long. When it moved, the shoulders hunched forward in this unsettling way, and its arms swung with each step. I realized I'd been holding my breath. Jake's hand found mine, and squeezed so tight it hurt, but I barely noticed. Neither of us said a word. We just stood there, frozen, watching this thing. It started to walk, moving with deliberate steps along the edge of our yard toward the hayfield. It never dropped to all fours like a bear would. It stayed upright the whole time, walking like a person, but not. Its head was partially turned toward us the entire time, keeping us in view as it moved. The light caught its body, and I could see it was covered in thick, dark hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy bear, but dense and uniform across its entire body. I've seen plenty of bears in these woods, and this wasn't a bear. Bears don't have that silhouette. They don't move that way. As it moved away, I could make out more details. A back so broad you could set a table on it, a chest like a barrel, and legs that looked powerful enough to crush a watermelon. There was no neck to speak of, just this massive head that seemed to sit directly on those enormous shoulders. It took maybe 30 seconds for it to cross the visible part of our property and disappear into the darkness of the tall grass in the hayfield. 30 seconds that felt like an eternity. Once it was gone, Jake practically dragged me back inside and locked the door. We were both breathing hard, like we'd just run a marathon. "What the fuck was that?" I whispered, afraid it might hear me somehow. Jake shook his head. I don't know. It wasn't a bear. I was certain of that. No, definitely not a bear. We stayed up until almost 3 in the morning, talking about what we'd seen. We both kept checking the windows, making sure the doors were locked. The dogs refused to come inside that night, which was completely unlike them. They stayed huddled in their doghouses until morning. When daylight came, Jake and I went out to where we'd seen the creature. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and there were footprints, not bear prints, not human prints either. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and shaped wrong, too wide in the middle, with what looked like 5 toes. They sank deep into the mud, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the hayfield. The grass had been pushed down in a path about 2 feet wide, leading toward the tree line at the back of our property. Neither of us felt brave enough to follow it into the woods. That afternoon, I went online and started researching. I felt ridiculous typing Bigfoot sightings Arkansas into Google, but what else could I do? Turns out there have been dozens of reports from the Ozarks over the years. People describing exactly what we saw, the height, the proportions, the arm length, the way it moved. I've never been one for supernatural stuff or conspiracy theories. I'm a practical person. I believe what I can see and touch. But I saw something that night that doesn't fit into my understanding of the world, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. We didn't tell many people. Who would believe us? My brother laughed when I tried to describe it to him. My best friend suggested we'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs. Jake's mum asked if we'd been drinking, so we mostly kept it to ourselves. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me jump. Jake started keeping his hunting rifle closer to the bed. We installed more security lights around the property. The dogs were different too, more alert, more protective, always watching the tree line at dusk. Sometimes I'd catch Jake staring out the window at night, scanning the darkness. We'd make eye contact and neither of us would need to say anything. We were both thinking the same thing. Is it still out there? It's been years now, and we've never seen it again. Life returned to normal mostly. We still keep the porch light on all night. We still look a little longer into the darkness when we hear unusual noises. I still get chills when I have to walk across the yard after sunset. People around here have stories. Hunters who found strange structures in the woods, hikers who've heard weird vocalizations that don't match any known animal, farmers missing livestock with no explanation. Before that night, I'd write those off as tall tales or misidentifications. Now I listen. I don't know what we saw. I don't want to put a label on it because saying Bigfoot or Sasquatch makes it sound like some cartoon character, and what we witnessed was flesh and blood and terrifying in its realness. It was a creature that shouldn't exist but does. The image that sticks with me most isn't even the creature itself. It's our dogs. 3 fearless farm dogs who faced down every predator these mountains have to offer, hiding and trembling. They knew something we didn't. They sensed what that thing was capable of, and it terrified them. Sometimes Jake and I will be sitting on the porch in the evening, enjoying the sunset, and we'll catch each other looking at that spot by the mineral feeder. We don't need to speak. We're both remembering those 30 seconds that changed how we see the world. I still don't know if I believe in Bigfoot in the way people talk about on TV shows, but I know what I saw. I know those eyes looked at me with intelligence. I know those footprints were real, and I know that somewhere in these woods, there's something that science says shouldn't exist. Every time I hear coyotes suddenly stop howling in the middle of the night, I wonder if they've sensed it too. Every time our motion sensor lights trigger and I look out to see nothing there, I wonder if it's just beyond the reach of the light watching us. I don't go into our backfield alone anymore. Some things you just don't mess with. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. But I'll never forget those yellow eyes reflecting in the porch light, or the way it kept us in its sight as it walked away, like it was memorizing us, like it was deciding. Story 6. I've never shared this with anyone except my wife and a few close friends, but I need to get this off my chest. I still can't explain what happened that night in Cedar Hills, and it's been eating away at me for years. My family and I had just moved into our new home in a development called Cedar Hills about 7 months ago. It was a nice neighborhood, still under construction in some areas, but peaceful and exactly what we wanted for raising our 2 kids. The houses were spaced pretty far apart, with plenty of woods surrounding the development. I'd been working on building a cedar plank fence around our property, partly for privacy, partly because of a problem we had with some wild dogs in the area. These weren't your typical strays. There were 4 of them, big ones that roamed around at night. Most of us in the neighborhood were concerned, especially those with young children. Animal control had been called multiple times, but those dogs were smart and always disappeared before anyone could catch them. Anyway, it was late summer, probably mid-August. The nights were still warm, and I remember having the windows open to catch whatever breeze we could. My wife and kids were already asleep, but I was up reading in our bedroom. I've always been a night owl. It must have been around midnight, maybe a little after. I was sitting in bed with just the bedside lamp on, completely absorbed in my book when I first heard the dogs barking in the distance. Didn't think much of it at first. Those mutts were always making noise, but then the barking got louder and more frantic, like they were excited about something. I realized they were getting closer to our house, much closer. Then I heard them right outside, their barking becoming absolutely hysterical. It was clear they weren't just roaming, they were chasing something. Whatever it was, they had followed it straight into our backyard. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. 3 distinct heavy footfalls, that's what I heard. Not the patter of dog paws, but something much larger. Thud, thud, thud. Something big was running around the corner of our garage and heading directly under my window. The footsteps were spaced far apart, like whatever was making them had a long stride, and they were heavy, each one making the ground vibrate slightly. Then there was this impact against the side of the house, so powerful that it literally cracked one of the support beams. My whole bedroom shook. Books fell off the shelf. My water glass tipped over. I froze, completely paralyzed with fear. Before I could even process what was happening, there was a second impact, and this one hit about 7 feet up from the ground, right across my window frame. I know the height because I measured it the next day. The window frame splintered and the glass rattled but didn't break. After the second impact, I heard this loud exhalation, not quite a grunt, not quite a breath, but something in between, followed by the sound of a heavy body hitting the ground. It sounded like whatever it was had fallen. Those dogs were still going crazy outside, and I was worried they might attack whoever or whatever had fallen. I reached over to pull back the curtain to look outside. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip the fabric. Just as my fingers touched the curtain, I heard it. A growl, but not just any growl. This was deep, steady, and unmistakably hostile. It was coming from right outside my window at head level. Remember, my bedroom is on the ground floor. The growl lasted about 2.5 seconds, and it was unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. Not like a dog, not like a bear, not like any animal I know. It was deeper, more guttural, almost intelligent sounding, if that makes any sense. The growl stopped, and then there was complete silence. The dogs had gone quiet too. The silence was almost worse than the noise. At least with the noise, I knew where everything was. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, I heard movement. Whatever it was brushed against the side of the house as it rounded the corner. The siding made this scraping sound, like something rough was dragging against it. As soon as it moved away from my window, the dogs started up again, resuming their chase. I heard a crash from the side yard where I'd stacked some 2x4s for the fence project. The lumber went flying. I could hear pieces hitting the ground in rapid succession. Then came the most impossible sound. A heavy thud, followed by rustling from the top of my fence, the one I had just finished building earlier that week. It was 6 feet tall. Whatever this thing was, it had just cleared my 6-foot fence in what sounded like a single bound. The dogs' barking faded into the distance as they continued the chase into the woods behind our property. And then, silence again. That's when I noticed the smell. I hadn't picked up on it before with all the commotion, but now it filled my room through the open window. It was powerful and revolting, like a mix of wet dog, stale urine, body odor, and this weird chemical smell like burnt rubber. It was so strong I started gagging. I rushed to close the window, but the smell had already permeated everything. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in bed with a baseball bat in my hands until sunrise, listening to every little sound, convinced that whatever had been outside my window was going to come back. My wife woke up at some point and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't even explain it properly. I just told her I thought someone had tried to break in, but they'd run off. When morning finally came, I went outside to check the damage. What I saw confirmed that I hadn't imagined any of it. My flower bed under the window was completely crushed, with deep indentations in the soil. The decorative trellis my wife had put up was flattened. The 2 goat fours I'd stacked were scattered all over the side yard like they'd been kicked by something powerful. But the most disturbing thing was what I found on the fence. About halfway down, where the thing would have jumped, there was a clump of hair stuck to a rough part of the cedar. It was coarse, dark black hair with these reddish-brown highlights, about 3 inches long with an oily sheen to it. It wasn't human hair, and it definitely wasn't from a dog. I put it in a plastic bag, intending to show it to someone, a park ranger maybe, or animal control, but I never did. Part of me was afraid of what they'd tell me. Here's the strangest part of all. After that night, no one in the neighborhood ever saw those 4 feral dogs again, not one. It was like they vanished into thin air. When I casually asked around if anyone had seen them, people just shook their heads and said good riddance. I've spent countless hours trying to come up with a rational explanation for what happened that night. Could it have been a bear? No, we don't have bears in this area, and the growl was all wrong. A person. No way could a human make that sound or jump that fence like that. Mountain lion? Again, the sound was wrong, and they don't typically stand at the height where that growl came from. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear those heavy footfalls and that unnatural growl. I've reinforced my fence, installed security cameras, and even considered moving. But my wife thinks I'm overreacting to what she believes was just some kind of wild animal. Maybe she's right. Maybe it was just some animal I'm not familiar with. But deep down, I know better. Whatever was outside my window that night wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in our world. And the worst part, sometimes when I'm working in the yard, I get the feeling I'm being watched from the tree line, like whatever it was might still be out there, waiting. I still have that clump of hair in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, wondering what kind of creature it came from. But maybe some questions are better left unanswered. Story 7. I still can't explain what lives in those woods back home. I've thought about sharing this for years, but always talked myself out of it. People don't believe what they can't understand, and honestly, I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I need to get this off my chest. I grew up in rural Bamberg County, South Carolina, about 15 miles west of the main town, in a small farming community. My family's been there for generations. Same land, same houses, same stories passed down. We weren't rich, but we had each other and plenty of space. Our nearest neighbor was half a mile down the dirt road. My first experience happened when I was around 7 years old. It was a warm spring evening, and we were all sitting on the porch after dinner. Me, my parents, and my grandpa who lived with us. It must have been around 9 o'clock. The sun had just set, and that purple-blue twilight was settling in. We were just talking, nothing special, when we heard it. I've never heard anything like it since. It was a scream, but not human, not quite animal either. It started low and rose to this pitch that made my scalp prickle and my stomach turn. It echoed through the trees and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Our dog Rex was a German Shepherd mix, about 90 pounds and fearless. He'd chase off coyotes and once even cornered a black bear that wandered onto our property. But that night, Rex barked once, let out this pitiful yelp like he'd been kicked and bolted under the house. He wouldn't come out until morning, not even for food. My dad and Grandpa grabbed flashlights and a shotgun and went to check the yard and the edge of the woods. They found nothing. The next morning, my grandpa showed me half a footprint in the soft dirt near our garden. It was like a human print, but wider, with toes that seemed longer. He didn't say much about it, just looked at it for a long time before scraping it away with his boot. I remember my mom and grandpa arguing that day. She wanted to call the sheriff, but he insisted it was just a woods thing and to leave it be. That was the first time I realized there might be things in our woods that people didn't talk about. Years went by without incident. I grew up like any country kid, fishing, exploring, helping with chores. By the time I was 12, I was spending a lot of time fishing at the pond behind my grandfather's place. It was about a quarter-mile into the woods, surrounded by tall pines and oaks that had been there longer than any of us. One afternoon in late July, my cousin Matt and I were fishing at that pond. It was muggy as hell, one of those days where your shirt sticks to your back within minutes. The fish weren't biting, but we were stubborn. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed this smell. At first, I thought it might be a dead animal nearby, or maybe a skunk, but it was stronger and more sour. It made my eyes water. Matt noticed it too. We were looking around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, when we heard it. A sharp scream from the tree line behind us, maybe 50 yards back, followed by a few quick grunts. Then nothing. Heavy silence. Even the insects stopped chirping. We sat frozen for what felt like forever. Neither of us said anything. Eventually, the crickets started up again, and we packed our gear without a word and headed home. We never discussed what happened that day, not even on the walk back. It was like we both understood that talking about it would make it more real. I didn't go back to that pond alone for almost a year. When I was 16, I was wandering through the woods by myself. These were thick pine and oak woods that stretched for miles between properties. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, or thought I did. That day, I kept feeling like someone was watching me. You know that sensation when the hairs on your neck stand up? It was like that, but stronger. I crossed an old barbed wire fence that marked the edge of our property. There was a logging road beyond it that I sometimes used as a shortcut. I spent maybe half an hour exploring beyond the road before heading back the same way. When I got back to the fence, I stopped dead in my tracks. The fence was partly pushed over, with fresh dirt turned up around the posts, like something had stepped on them. And there were footprints, clear as day in the soft dirt. They looked human, but broader and longer than my size. 12 boots. They led from the woods to the road, then veered back into the trees about 20 yards down. I stood there staring at those prints, trying to make sense of them. They weren't bear tracks. I knew what those looked like. These had 5 toes, a heel, an arch, like a person walking barefoot, but bigger than any person I'd ever met. I ran all the way home, didn't tell anyone. The following summer, my friend Jake came to visit from Charleston City, kid. But we'd been friends since elementary school when his family lived nearby before moving. I took him into those same woods, partly to show him around, partly because I wanted someone else to see something. Anything that would confirm I wasn't imagining things. We were following a small creek that cut through the property, picking our way along the muddy bank. It was around noon, hot but not unbearable under the tree cover. Jake was ahead of me when he stopped suddenly, just froze mid-step. I almost bumped into him. "What's wrong?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his face drained of color. I followed his gaze. About 25 yards ahead, near a fallen log beside the creek, was what I initially thought was a dark stump, until it moved. The figure rose straight up like a man standing from a crouch, but it kept rising. 7, maybe 8 feet tall when it was fully upright. It had deep brown hair covering its body, except for its face, which was flatter with less hair. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but I could see its eyes catching the sunlight. We backed away slowly, no sudden movements. The thing matched our pace, following along its side of the creek, but keeping that distance between us. We backed up maybe 100 yards before we reached the edge of a pasture that belonged to a neighboring farm. The creature stopped there, half hidden in the brush, watching us as we kept backing into the open field. Once we hit the middle of the pasture, we turned and ran, didn't stop running until we reached my house. Jake left the next day. His parents came to get him early. He called them and made up some excuse about feeling sick. Before he left, he made me promise not to tell anyone what we saw. "They'll think we're crazy," he said. He's never visited again, and we barely keep in touch now. I went away to college after high school, got a job in Columbia, and only came back home for holidays and occasional weekends. Part of me was relieved to be away from those woods, but they were still home. 4 years ago, during a Thanksgiving visit, my old high school buddy Chris and I were shooting cans with a .22 rifle behind my parents' house. It was getting dark, around 5:30 in late November. We had a lantern set up to see the cans. I was lining up a shot when I spotted movement on the county road about 200 yards away. A tall, man-shaped form was crossing the road. Even from that distance, I could tell it was way too big to be a person. It moved with this strange, fluid gait, like a person walking but with longer strides. It crossed the road in about 3 seconds and disappeared into the thicket on the other side. Chris saw it too. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I just shook my head. We packed up and went inside. Later that night, Chris and I were having beers on the porch. He finally brought it up. "That thing we saw, you think it was a bear?" I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for that long, and they don't move like that. But I just said, "Probably." He seemed relieved by that answer, and we moved on to other topics. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, about all of it. The screams, the footprints, the figure by the creek, the shape crossing the road. They were all connected, all the same thing. I've spent years researching, trying to make sense of what lives in those woods. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, watched documentaries, even joined online forums where people share similar experiences. Some of the stories sound so familiar it's unsettling. The locals don't talk about it much. When they do, it's in vague terms. The woods thing, or that old creature. My grandpa, before he passed, finally told me that his father and grandfather had their own encounters. It's been there for generations, whatever it is. Last year, I installed game cameras on trees around my parents' property, hoping to catch something. After 3 months, all I had were deer, raccoons, and one blurry image of something tall moving between trees at night. It could have been anything. I went back home about 3 months ago to help my dad with some repairs on the barn. Around dusk, I was walking back from the hardware store in town. My truck was in the shop, and my dad needed the car. It's only about 2 miles from town to our place, and I've walked it hundreds of times. I was about halfway home when that familiar feeling washed over me, the sensation of being watched. The road there cuts through dense woods with no streetlights. The spring peepers were loud in the ditches, but as I walked, they went silent, section by section, like something was moving parallel to me in the woods. Then came the smell, that same rank, sour smell from the pond years ago. I picked up my pace, trying not to run. Running triggers chasing. Every country kid knows that. Something large moved through the underbrush about 30 yards to my right. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling. Whatever it was keeping pace with me, staying just out of sight. Then it vocalized. Not the scream from my childhood, but a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from something with a chest deeper than a barrel. It raised the hairs on my arms despite the warm evening. I was about a quarter mile from our driveway when I heard it move, not alongside me anymore, but behind me, following. I risked a glance over my shoulder. In the fading light, I could make out a massive silhouette about 50 yards back. It was standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, watching me. Even at that distance, I could tell it was at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. I walked faster, fighting the urge to run. When I looked back again, it was closer, maybe 30 yards now, still not moving when I looked, but somehow closing the distance. 20 yards from our driveway, I broke into a sprint. I heard heavy footsteps behind me, faster than a man could run. I didn't look back. I hit our driveway and kept running until I reached the porch. The motion lights came on as I scrambled up the steps. From the safety of the porch, I looked back toward the road. Nothing. But at the edge of the light's reach, where our driveway meets the county road, I saw it, just standing there, half in shadow. It was massive, covered in dark hair, with a head that sat directly on its shoulders, with almost no neck. It stood perfectly still, watching me for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it turned and melted into the darkness beyond our property. I told my dad what happened. He wasn't surprised. He just nodded and said, "It's never hurt anyone that I know of, just keeps its distance and watches, been here longer than us." I don't know what lives in the woods of Bamberg County. I don't know if it's the same creature that Native Americans told stories about, or if it's something science hasn't classified yet. All I know is that it's real, it's intelligent, and it's been watching my family for generations. I'm back in Colombia now, but I still can't shake the feeling that someday I'll look out my apartment window and see that silhouette standing under the streetlight, watching, waiting, for what? I don't know. Bedut, Story 8. I still can't sleep right. 3 months after what happened up in the Beartooth Mountains, I find myself jolting awake at the slightest noise outside my window. I keep the blinds drawn tight now, even though I live in the middle of town. Bill thinks I'm being paranoid, but he wasn't the one who saw that thing up close through the drone camera. He didn't see its eyes. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just 2 maintenance guys from Red Cloud escaping the daily grind of fixing other people's problems. Bill and I had been planning this fishing trip for months, nothing fancy, just a couple days camping near Boulder River. We both needed the break. Working maintenance at the community college means dealing with everyone else's crap all day. And after 6 straight months of backed-up toilets and flickering fluorescents, we were ready for some peace and quiet. We left early on a Friday morning in June, my old Tacoma loaded with our gear. Bill brought his top-shelf fishing equipment. The guy takes his trout fishing way too seriously. And I packed my DJI Mavic Pro drone. I'd saved up 3 months for that thing, and this was my first chance to really test it out in the wilderness. The drive took about 4 hours, cutting through Billings and then heading southwest toward the mountains. We found a spot near 4 Mile Guard Station, about 12 miles from the highway, down a rutted Forest Service road. Perfect isolation. No cell service, no other campers, just us and the wilderness. The spot was gorgeous, a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines with Boulder River about 50 yards away. We could see the Beartooth Range rising up beyond the tree line, all jagged peaks and massive granite cliffs. We set up camp quickly. 2 small tents, a fire pit, and our gear stashed in the truck. Nothing complicated. Bill was itching to get his line in the water before sunset, so we hiked down to the river. The fishing was decent. Bill caught a couple of small cutthroat, and I mostly just enjoyed being away from civilization. The whole time, though, I kept getting this weird feeling at the back of my neck, like we were being observed. "You feel that?" I asked Bill as he was releasing his 3rd trout. "Feel what?" he said, not even looking up. "Like something's watching us." Bill laughed. "Probably just a deer or an elk, maybe a bear checking us out from a distance. That's why we hung the food, remember?" I tried to brush it off, but that sensation stuck with me as darkness fell, and we headed back to camp. We cooked the 1 trout Bill kept over the fire, had a few beers, and turned in around 11. That's when things got weird. I was almost asleep when I heard it. A deep, resonant sound echoing down from the cliffs above our camp. It wasn't quite a roar or a howl, more like this impossibly deep bass note that vibrated through my chest. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before tapering off. I've heard bears, wolves, cougars. This wasn't anything like that. This sound felt deliberate, like someone trying to communicate. I unzipped my tent and whispered across to Bill's. "You hear that?" His flashlight clicked on. "Yeah, what the hell was it?" "No idea. Mountain lion, maybe?" Even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to be moving, circling above our camp along the ridgeline. Bill emerged from his tent with his flashlight, scanning the darkness. "That's no cougar," he said, voice tight. We stayed up another hour, listening as the sound gradually moved farther away until we couldn't hear it anymore. Neither of us slept well that night. I kept jerking awake, thinking I'd heard footsteps around the tent. When morning came, Bill was acting like nothing happened. Classic Bill. If he can't explain something, he pretends it doesn't exist. "Still want to fish today?" he asked, boiling water for coffee. "After that noise last night, aren't you a little freaked out?" He shrugged. "Probably just some weird echo in the mountains, or maybe a moose. They make weird sounds sometimes. I'd never heard a moose that sounded anything like what we'd heard, but I let it go. After breakfast, Bill grabbed his gear and headed for the river. I decided to stay at camp and fly my drone, partly to test it out, partly because I wanted to see what was up on those cliffs. The Mavic Pro has about a 27-minute battery life, so I figured I'd do a quick survey of the area. I launched from our campsite clearing and guided it up toward the cliff face where I thought the sounds had come from. The drone's camera feed displayed on my phone, and as I piloted it over the ridgeline, I could see the terrain opened up into a series of rocky outcroppings and small meadows dotted with stands of pine. That's when I spotted it. At first I thought it was a grizzly, a large reddish-brown shape, partially hidden behind a boulder about 300 yards from our camp. I maneuvered the drone a bit closer, curious but cautious. If it was a bear, I didn't want to spook it. As the camera zoomed in, my blood went cold. This was no bear. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and it was standing upright on 2 legs. Its body was covered in thick, reddish-brown fur that looked matted in places, but it was the face that made me nearly drop the controller. It had a wide, flat nose and a heavy brow ridge over large eyes that seemed to reflect the sunlight. Its face was somewhere between human and ape, but neither one exactly. It looked ancient, powerful, and it was watching something. I adjusted the drone's position slightly and saw what had captured the creature's attention. 2 hikers were making their way down a trail about a quarter mile from where it was hiding. They had no idea it was there, stalking them from above. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost crashed the drone into a tree. I had to warn those people somehow. I tried shouting, but there was no way they could hear me from our camp. The creature must have heard something, though, because it suddenly looked directly at my drone, almost like it knew I was watching. Then it opened its mouth and let out that same sound from the night before, that deep, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the mountain itself. Through the drone's microphone, it sounded distorted and mechanical, but unmistakable. "Bill!" I screamed. "Bill, get back here now!" Bill came running up from the river, his fishing rod still in hand. "What? What's wrong?" I just pointed at my phone screen. "Look." He leaned over my shoulder, and I watched his expression change from annoyed to disbelieving. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered. "I think it's stalking those hikers," I said. The creature was moving now, paralleling the trail from above, keeping to the cover of rocks and trees. They have no idea it's there. "We need to do something," Bill said. I made a split-second decision. If I couldn't warn the hikers directly, maybe I could distract the creature. I turned the drone toward it and accelerated, flying directly at its position. The creature noticed the drone's approach and stood upright, its full height now visible. It had to be nearly 8 feet tall. Its proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, shoulders impossibly broad. It stared at the drone with what looked like confusion, then anger. I crashed the drone deliberately into the creature's chest. The video feed went instantly to static. The last thing I saw was its massive hand reaching up toward the camera. "Holy shit," Bill breathed. "Did you just—" "We need to get out of there," I said, already moving to break down our camp. "Those hikers are in danger." We packed everything in record time, throwing tents and supplies haphazardly into the truck. I kept looking over my shoulder at the cliffs, expecting to see that thing coming for us next. Bill, who had been skeptical about everything up until seeing the creature on my phone, was now moving with frantic energy. We drove out the Forest Service road at dangerous speeds, the truck bouncing wildly over ruts and rocks. When we reached the main highway, I turned east toward Big Timber, figuring that's where the hikers would head if they made it out. We found them at a gas station just outside of town. A man and woman in their 30s, standing beside a blue Toyota Tacoma, both looking shell-shocked. The woman was crying while the man filled their tank, his hand visibly shaking as he handled the nozzle. I pulled up beside them and rolled down my window. "Excuse me," I called. "Were you just hiking up near Boulder River?" They both looked at me with wide eyes. The man stepped protectively in front of the woman. "Who's asking?" "I'm the guy with the drone," I said. "I saw something up there, following you." The woman burst into fresh tears. The man's posture changed immediately. "You saw it too?" he asked, voice low. "We thought we were losing our minds. We ended up talking for almost an hour in the gas station parking lot. They told us they'd heard something following them for at least a mile, breaking branches and making that strange calling sound. They'd tried to hurry, but the trail was rough. Then they saw my drone crash into something on the ridge above them. Whatever it was let out a scream of rage, and they ran the rest of the way to their truck. "I think you saved our lives," the woman said, finally composing herself. "That thing was hunting us. They took my phone number before they left, promising to call when they reached Bozeman. They did call later that night to thank me again." The woman mentioned that her husband was an avid Bigfoot researcher, and he was convinced that's what we'd seen, a Sasquatch. He wanted me to report it to some research organization, but I declined. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. I never recovered my drone or its footage. Part of me is glad. I don't think I want to see that thing up close again, even on video. When we got back to Red Cloud, I looked up the area on maps and discovered we'd been camping near a place called Laboon Mountain. A quick internet search showed several reported Bigfoot sightings in that region over the years. Bill doesn't like to talk about what happened. He's gone back to fishing that same river twice since then, though he admits he stays closer to the highway now. As for me, I won't be going back to the Beartooths ever. I've actually started looking for maintenance jobs in bigger towns, places with streetlights and neighbors close by. Sometimes at night, I still hear that sound in my dreams, that deep, reverberating call echoing down from the cliffs. I wake up sweating, convinced something is watching me through my bedroom window. I keep telling myself it can't reach me here, in town, with locked doors and neighbors just a shout away. But then I remember the intelligence I saw in those eyes as it stared directly at my drone, like it knew exactly what it was looking at, like it understood. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 9. I haven't told many people about this because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy, but I need to get this off my chest. And I figure if anyone would understand, it would be you all. This happened about 6 years ago. My husband Michael and I were avid hikers back then. We still are, I guess, but we're a lot more cautious now about where we go. We had been planning this hiking trip in northern British Columbia for months. We'd researched trails, packed all the right gear, and were super excited to explore some of the more remote areas. It was early June, and the weather was perfect for hiking. Not too hot, not too cold. We'd been on the trail for about 4 hours that day. We weren't on any official trail at that point. We'd veered off to explore a less traveled area that looked interesting on our map. The forest was dense, old growth with massive trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful, but also, I don't know, there was something about the quiet that felt heavy. Around mid-afternoon, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. At first, I thought it was just a weird natural formation, but as we got closer, we realized it was some kind of structure. It was huge. I'd guess about 15 to 20 feet long. It looked like a den or shelter of some kind, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. The thing that really struck me was how deliberately it seemed to be constructed. It wasn't random at all. The base was made of what looked like rotten tree sawdust, cedar branches and wood shavings, all mixed with moss and dirt. Everything was packed down tightly over torn and chewed wood chips, and the branches and twigs weren't just thrown together. They were actually woven together to form a cover over a large hole that had been dug into the ground. Michael is an environmental scientist, so he immediately started examining it, trying to figure out what animal could have built it. But I've never heard of any animal in North America that builds structures like this. Bears don't weave branches together. Beavers don't work with sawdust and moss. It was just wrong. The structure was even more bizarre because several large trees had been dragged across the top of it. These weren't small saplings. They were substantial trees that would have taken incredible strength to move. And they all connected to this massive fallen old-growth tree that crossed right over the trail we'd been following. It was like the whole thing had been engineered. What really sent chills down my spine was what we saw around the den. There were 15 to 20 trees in the vicinity that had clearly been deliberately pushed over. They weren't uprooted by wind or natural causes. They were snapped off at about 6 feet high, and every single one was arranged to point toward the den, like markers or warnings. Michael, being the curious guy he is, actually climbed up on the fallen tree that crossed over the nest to get a better look. I was hanging back a bit, taking photos and feeling increasingly uneasy. That's when I saw them. 2 silver-black eyes blinking in the darkness near a black hole right beside Michael's leg. My blood went cold. I couldn't even scream at first. Before I could warn Michael, we both heard it, a sound like someone slamming large rocks against trees. 3 loud smacks that echoed through the forest, then a pause, then 3 more even more powerful thumps that literally shook the ground underneath our feet. I'm not exaggerating. I could feel the vibrations coming up through my hiking boots. I finally found my voice and screamed at Michael to get down from there. He jumped off the log and we both stood frozen, staring at each other. That's when I noticed something black moving rapidly through the trees to our left. It wasn't just moving, it was paralleling us, like it was trying to cut us off from the direction we'd come from. We didn't need to discuss what to do next. We just ran. Not back the way we came, because whatever was moving through the trees was blocking that path. Instead, we continued forward, past the den, hoping to loop around eventually. I've never run so fast in my life. The whole time I felt like something was right behind us, but I was too terrified to look back. We eventually made it back to our campsite and packed up immediately, even though it was getting dark. We drove 3 hours to the nearest town and got a motel room. Neither of us slept that night. For 3 years, we didn't talk about it much. We still went hiking, but always in popular, well-traveled areas. We told a few close friends, but most people just assumed we'd spooked ourselves over nothing. Then, 3 years later, we decided to go back to that general area. Not to the exact same spot, but to a nearby trail system. I know it sounds crazy to go back, but we'd convinced ourselves that we had overreacted. Plus, we were with a group this time, 6 other experienced hikers who we'd met through an online hiking forum. The first day was uneventful, beautiful views, good weather, no problems. The second day, though, things started getting weird. We were about 5 miles into our hike when we started hearing these strange, cackling sounds coming from the forest around us. Not like any bird or animal I'd ever heard, more like a person trying to imitate a laugh, but getting it wrong somehow. Everyone in the group noticed it, and there was this immediate tension. One woman, Jess, who had been totally fine all morning, suddenly had what looked like a panic attack. She was gasping for breath, saying she felt like something was watching us. 2 guys from our group tried to calm her down, but then she started acting really strange, speaking in this whisper and refusing to look up at the trees. She kept saying, "They're up there, they're watching from the trees." We gave her some water and decided to keep moving, thinking maybe the elevation was affecting her, but as we continued our hike, I started feeling that same heaviness in the air that I'd felt 3 years before. Michael felt it too. I could tell by the way he kept scanning the tree line. About an hour later, we came across another massive tree stump positioned across the trail. Just like before, there was a den-like hole underneath it. It was smaller than the one we'd seen years ago, but the construction was identical. The same mixture of materials, the same weaving pattern of branches. I grabbed Michael's arm so hard, I probably left bruises, and we both knew this wasn't a coincidence. We tried to act normal, not wanting to freak out the rest of the group. We suggested turning around, making up some excuse about the weather changing, but the others wanted to push on to see some cliffs that were supposed to be about a mile ahead. We reached the cliffs without incident, but during our descent, we heard it, powerful crashing through the trees as something leapt down the slope parallel to our path. It wasn't subtle at all. Whatever it was large and moving fast, taking these huge leaping strides down the hill. 3 people in our group saw it. They described it as light brown, upright and hairy, with arms that seemed too long for its body. They only caught glimpses as it moved between trees, but they were all describing the same thing. As we hurried down the trail, we heard these deep moaning sounds following us. Not growls or roars like a bear or mountain lion. These were almost human-like, but deeper than any human voice could go. They echoed off the cliffs behind us, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. We practically ran the last 2 miles back to our cars. The whole time, I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you something's there, just out of sight. Even after we reached the parking area and piled into our vehicles, the feeling didn't go away. I kept checking the rearview mirror as we drove, convinced I'd see something following us on the road. I've spent countless hours researching what we might have encountered. I've read about bears, cougars, all the known wildlife in British Columbia. Nothing explains what we saw. The structure was too complex for any known animal. The tree breaks were too high up and too deliberate. And what animal moves upright through dense forest with enough force to make the ground shake? The only explanation that makes any sense is one I'm still reluctant to say out loud. But if I'm being honest, I believe we stumbled upon a Sasquatch den twice, and both times we were being watched and followed by whatever built it. I still have nightmares about those silver-black eyes blinking in the darkness. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear those 3 rhythmic thumps against the trees, and I still haven't gone hiking in remote areas since that second encounter. I don't know what else to say except that I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. Something intelligent built those structures. Something powerful broke those trees. Something was watching us and following us, and whatever it wasn't human. Story 10. I've never told this to anyone outside my immediate family. Part of me still has trouble believing it happened, but every detail is burned into my memory like it was yesterday, not 40 years ago. This happened back in the summer of '84 when I was 13 years old. My younger brother Noah was 11, and we were camping with our friends Caleb, also 13, and his little brother Benjamin, 10. We were in the woods behind Caleb's house near Dexter, Michigan. This wasn't some wilderness expedition. Caleb's house was maybe a quarter-mile away through the trees. We'd all been in Cub Scouts together, so our parents trusted us to camp overnight without supervision. We picked this spot we'd used before, a small hilltop with a nice flat area perfect for a tent, curving around a stream that ran through the property. I remember how excited we were, carrying our supplies from Caleb's house. Just basic stuff like sleeping bags, flashlights, some snacks and matches for the fire. We didn't have fancy gear or anything, just kids being kids, you know? The day started out perfect. We set up our tent, one of those old rectangular canvas ones with aluminum poles that weighed a ton. We gathered firewood, splashed in the stream, and played those stupid games boys that age play. I remember Noah and Benjamin built a small dam in the stream with rocks, while Caleb and I explored further into the woods, looking for walking sticks. Normal stuff. As it started getting dark, we built our fire in the existing fire ring. Caleb knew what he was doing, and soon we had a decent blaze going. We roasted hot dogs on sticks and made s'mores with Hershey bars that had melted in our backpacks. We told the usual ghost stories, trying to scare each other. Nothing unusual at all. It was around 9 or 9:30 when things changed. The woods were doing their normal nighttime thing, crickets chirping, frogs croaking by the stream, occasional rustling as small animals moved through the underbrush. Just normal wood sounds that fade into the background when you're camping. Then we heard it. The first call came from downstream, maybe a couple hundred yards away. I've spent decades trying to describe this sound, and I still can't do it justice. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before or since. The call had 3 distinct parts. It started with this short, sharp sound, almost like someone quickly clearing their throat. Then came the middle part, louder, more sustained, like a weird mix between a howl and a moan. The final part was this higher-pitched screech that seemed to echo through the trees. When we first heard it, we all just kind of froze. Benjamin asked, "What was that?" And Caleb tried to play it cool, saying it was probably just an owl or something, but I could tell from his face he didn't believe that. We all knew the local animals. We spent tons of time in these woods. This wasn't a deer, wasn't an owl, wasn't a coyote. After a few minutes we went back to talking, but we were all on edge. Then it came again. The same 3-part call, but closer now. Maybe 150 yards away. We stopped talking altogether this time. Noah scooted closer to me. "Should we go back to the house?" Benjamin whispered. "No way," Caleb said, trying to sound brave. "It's just some animal. It won't come near the fire." I wasn't so sure. The calls continued for the next half hour or so, each one getting closer. What made it extra creepy was that between calls, we could hear something moving through the woods. Heavy footsteps, sticks breaking. Not like a raccoon or possum, this was something substantial. By the 4th or 5th call, we could tell it was only about 30 or 40 yards from our campsite, down near the stream. Then the calls stopped. The footsteps stopped, and that's when it got really unsettling. The woods went completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing, just the crackling of our fire. We sat there in this bubble of firelight, all of us staring out into the darkness, not saying much. Eventually, we decided to get into the tent, thinking we'd feel safer. I remember we all kept our shoes on, just in case we needed to run. We zipped the tent closed and lay there in our sleeping bags, whispering about what it could have been. A bear. There weren't supposed to be bears in that part of Michigan. A crazy person. Possible, but why make those weird calls? Eventually, we all fell asleep, or at least most of us did. Noah told me the next morning that he woke up in the middle of the night. He wasn't sure what time, but the fire had died down to just embers. He said he heard something strange, like birds whistling back and forth through the trees. Not normal bird calls, but almost like signals. Then came the part that still gives me goosebumps. Noah said he heard heavy breathing just outside the tent wall. Not right next to his head, but definitely within a foot or two of the canvas. He was on the creek side of the tent. Whatever was out there had approached from the creek side, not from the direction of the house, which meant it had circled around the back of our camp. Noah was too scared to wake any of us up. He just lay there, frozen, listening to this thing breathing outside the tent. He said it stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably just a few minutes before it moved away. He didn't hear it leave. It was just gone. The next morning, while we were packing up, Noah pulled me aside and asked, "Does Caleb's dad ever come check on you guys when you camp out here?" I told him no, never. Caleb's dad trusted us out here. Why? Noah just shook his head and said, "Nothing, just wondering." It wasn't until we were walking home that he told me about the breathing outside the tent. I tried to convince him it was just his imagination, or maybe a raccoon, but he was adamant. It was breathing like a person, Ethan, but deeper, and it was tall. The breathing was coming from higher up the tent wall, not near the ground. We didn't talk about it much after that. We camped out there a few more times that summer, but never heard the calls again. I think we all kind of pushed it to the back of our minds. Fast forward to the following summer, '85. Noah and two of his friends were playing in those same woods one afternoon. I was back at our house when suddenly the back door slammed open and all three of them came running in, white as sheets and breathing hard. Noah could barely get the words out. "We saw something," he kept saying. "We saw something in the woods." When they calmed down enough to explain, they said they'd been playing near the stream, in roughly the same area where we'd heard the calls the summer before. Noah said he had this weird feeling of being watched, and when he looked up toward the trees on the hill, he saw something standing there. The way he described it was tall, really tall, and covered in dark hair or fur. It was just standing by a tree, watching us. His friends backed up his story completely. One of them added that when it realized they'd spotted it, it moved behind the tree, but it was so wide that they could still see parts of it sticking out. They'd immediately run all the way back to our house. My dad decided to check it out, and I went with him. We found the spot where they said they'd seen it. There weren't any clear footprints. The ground was pretty hard and covered with leaves. But there were broken branches on one of the trees, about 7 feet up, shoulder height for something really tall, and the woods felt strange, too quiet, with this heavy feeling in the air that's hard to describe. Looking back on it now, I can't help but connect the dots between what we heard that night in '84 and what Noah and his friends saw the next summer. The strange calls, the breathing outside our tent, the tall, hairy figure watching from the trees. It all seems related. I've read about other people's experiences since then. I know what some people would say we encountered, but I'm still not sure what to believe. All I know for certain is that something found us that night, something that didn't belong in those woods, at least not in the world as I understood it then. Sometimes I still wake up at night, thinking I hear that 3-part call in the distance. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting in the woods behind someone else's house. Story 11. I've been meaning to write this down for a long time. It's been almost 9 years, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This happened back in 2014 when I was really into gold panning. Nothing serious, just a weekend hobby that got me outdoors. My buddy Pete owned this piece of land in the Thickety Creek community, about 15 minutes south of Troy, in Montgomery County, North Carolina. He'd mentioned that there was a decent creek running through his property that might have some gold deposits. The area has some mining history, so it wasn't far-fetched. Pete said I could check it out any time, so one Saturday in late October, I decided to go take a look. It was one of those perfect fall days, not too hot, not too cold. I remember wearing just a light jacket. I drove out there around 10 in the morning, parked my truck at the gate since it was locked, and grabbed my backpack with my panning gear, some water and a sandwich. I also had my sidearm with me, which I always carried when heading into the woods alone. Nothing crazy, just a 9mm in a hip holster. You never know when you might run into a snake or an aggressive wild animal. The walk from the gate to the creek was about 200 yards through some pretty dense woods. Not a trail exactly, more like a path that Pete and his family had worn down over time. What stands out in my memory is the ridge to my right as I walked. It rose up steeply, maybe 60 feet or so. The whole area was thickly wooded, lots of oak and pine, typical for that part of North Carolina. When I got to the creek, I was pretty happy with what I saw. It was maybe 30 feet across, not too deep, but with some good flow to it. The water was clear, and I could see some promising gravel bars where gold might settle. I spent the next couple hours working my way along the edge, taking samples, panning, and just enjoying being out there. Didn't find much, a few tiny flakes, nothing to write home about. But that wasn't really the point anyway. Around noon, I decided to take a break, found a big flat rock near the creek edge to sit against, pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink. That's when things got weird. I was just sitting there looking at the water when I heard this sound from up on the ridge. At first I didn't think much of it. Woods make noises, right? But this was different. It was heavy, fast and rough, like something big moving through the upper branches of the trees, not like a squirrel or bird. Those make distinctive sounds. This was like branches breaking and leaves being pushed aside with force. My first thought was maybe a dead branch falling, but the sound was moving, not just dropping. It was traveling horizontally through the canopy. I've spent enough time in the woods to know most forest sounds, and this wasn't one I recognized. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. That's when I saw it, a rock about the size of a junior football sailing through the air from the direction of the ridge. It arced over the creek and landed with a solid thud on the opposite bank, maybe 10 yards downstream from where I was sitting. My heart jumped into my throat. That rock hadn't fallen. It had been thrown, and thrown hard. It cleared the entire width of the creek and still had enough momentum to dig into the dirt on the other side. Whatever threw it had serious strength. I immediately stood up, my hand moving to my sidearm. I unsnapped the holster but didn't draw. My mouth went completely dry. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone there?" Nothing, just the sound of the creek and a slight breeze. "I'm just panning here. Pete Miller gave me permission to be on the property." Still nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just my imagination. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. I felt like every inch of me was being observed, studied. I scanned the ridge, but couldn't see anything through the trees and undergrowth. Whatever was up there had the advantage. It could see me, but I couldn't see it. I started packing up my gear, trying to keep my movements casual while my heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't want to seem scared or like I was running away. Something primitive in my brain was telling me not to show fear. "I'm heading out now," I called again, still hoping it might be a hunter or hiker who just played a stupid prank. As I gathered my stuff, I kept glancing up at the ridge. The feeling of being watched never let up. I remember thinking about what could have thrown that rock. It wasn't small. I'd guess it weighed at least 5 pounds, and the force needed to throw it that distance. I couldn't figure it out. A bear? No, bears don't throw rocks. A person? Maybe, but I would have heard someone moving through that thick brush on the ridge before they got into position. The undergrowth was dense with thorny vines and deadfall. You can't move quietly through that stuff. I started walking back to my truck, moving faster than I'd like to admit. I didn't run. Something told me running would be a bad idea, but I walked with purpose. The whole time, I felt like something was keeping pace with me up on that ridge, moving parallel to my path. About halfway back to the truck, I heard more branch movement. This time ahead of me, I stopped dead in my tracks. Whatever it was seemed to be circling around to get in front of me. I drew my pistol then, not pointing it at anything, just holding it down by my side, safety still on. I'm not trigger happy, but having that weight in my hand made me feel a little better. "I don't want any trouble," I said loudly. "I'm just leaving." The woods went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just silence. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that's not normal. When the forest goes quiet, something's wrong. I changed my approach, moving away from the ridge and taking a wider path back to the gate. It meant pushing through some thicker brush, but I didn't want to be predictable. The whole time, that sensation of being watched followed me. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I felt such relief I almost got lightheaded. I walked the last 50 yards normally, trying to act like everything was fine. I unlocked the door, threw my gear in the passenger seat and got in. Only when the doors were locked and the engine was running did I let myself exhale. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror. Nothing followed me out to the main road, at least nothing I could see. I called Pete that evening and tried to explain what happened. He listened without interrupting, then was quiet for a few seconds. "You're not the first person to experience something weird on that part of the property," he finally said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "My uncle refuses to go down to that creek, says something followed him out there about 15 years ago. Never saw what it was, but said he felt like he was being hunted." Pete then told me that some of the old-timers in the area have stories about the woods around Thickety Creek. They call whatever lives out there a booger, or sometimes a wood booger. I'd never heard those terms before, but when I looked them up later, I realized they're regional names for what most people would call Bigfoot. I'm not saying that's what I encountered. I never saw anything clearly. But whatever threw that rock wasn't a normal animal from those woods. The strength and accuracy required to make that throw eliminates any known wildlife. And it couldn't have been a person, not without me hearing them approach through all that undergrowth. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. The rock didn't fall naturally. It was thrown with purpose, with enough power to clear a 30-foot creek. Maybe it was a warning shot telling me to leave. If so, it worked. I haven't been back to Pete's property since. In fact, I gave up gold panning altogether after that. I've also turned down several hunting trips when they involved being alone in unfamiliar woods. Something fundamental changed in me that day. I no longer feel like I'm at the top of the food chain when I'm in the forest. I still go hiking and camping, but only on established trails and never alone. And I always have this nagging feeling that I'm being watched when I'm in dense woods, especially if there's a ridge or high ground nearby. I don't know what was on that ridge at Thickety Creek that day. I don't know what threw that rock, but whatever it was powerful, intelligent, and didn't want me there. And 9 years later, I still get chills remembering how it felt to be sized up by something unseen in those woods. Something that could have done much worse than throw a warning shot if it had wanted to. Story 12. Have you never been the type to believe in monsters? Growing up in Northern California, I spent most of my life outdoors, hunting, fishing, camping, you name it. My brother Mark and I know those woods like the back of our hands, or at least we thought we did until the summer of 2011. What happened over those few weeks around Lake Pillsbury changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. I'm writing this down now because I need to get it off my chest. But honestly, I don't expect anyone to believe me. I barely believe it myself. It started in late August. Mark and I decided to do some night fishing on Lake Pillsbury. Nothing unusual about that. We'd done it 100 times before. The lake is pretty remote, tucked away in the Mendocino National Forest, and the fishing is usually decent. We took our small aluminum boat out around 9 in the evening, planning to catch some bass or maybe catfish. The night was clear, warm for that time of year, with a bright 3/4 moon that cast enough light to see without needing our headlamps much. We'd been out for maybe 2 hours, drifting near the eastern shore, when we started hearing these weird splashes. At first, I thought it was just fish jumping. That's normal at night. They come up to feed on insects, but these splashes were different. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic, and they were coming from the shoreline, not out in the water where fish would be. "You hear that?" Mark whispered, setting his rod down. I nodded, already feeling uneasy. We killed our small lantern and just listened. The splashes continued, moving parallel to us along the shore. Whatever was making them seemed to be pacing us. "Probably a deer coming down to drink," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't right. Deer don't splash around that consistently. We let the boat drift closer to shore, curiosity getting the better of us. The moon was bright enough that we could make out the tree line and the rocky beach, but not much detail beyond that. The splashing had stopped by then, which somehow made it worse. That's when the first rock hit the water. It landed maybe 10 feet from our boat with a distinct plunk. Not a pebble, a good-sized rock. "What the hell?" Mark hissed. Before I could answer, another rock hit closer, then another. They weren't landing randomly. They were getting closer to the boat with each throw. Someone, or something, was aiming at us. "Start the motor," I told Mark, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. He yanked the cord on our small outboard, but it took 3 pulls before it sputtered to life. In those few seconds, 2 more rocks hit the water, one close enough to send a spray over the side of the boat. As we started to pull away, that's when I heard it. Heavy, splashing footsteps pounding through the shallows where the rocks had been coming from. It wasn't the sound of a deer or even a bear entering water. It sounded exactly like a man running through knee-deep water, except the strides were too long, the splashes too powerful. We gunned the motor and got the hell out of there, not saying a word until we reached the dock. Even then, we didn't really discuss what happened. What was there to say? Someone threw rocks at us, but who would be out there at that hour, in that remote location, and why run through the water after us? I tried to convince myself it was just some locals messing with us, teenagers maybe, pulling a prank. That explanation almost worked, until what happened next. About 3 weeks later, in mid-September, Mark and his buddy Chris decided to go back to the area. Not for fishing this time, but to a picnic spot near the Platte River that feeds into Lake Pillsbury. They planned to do some stargazing, drink a few beers, and camp overnight. I couldn't go because of work, but Mark called me around 3 in the morning, his voice shaking. According to him, they'd been sitting by their campfire around 2 a.m. when they heard a loud snap from the trees about 50 yards away. When they shined their flashlights in that direction, they saw a birch tree bending back and forth as if something large had grabbed it and was shaking it. Then they heard a deep, rumbling growl that Mark said wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't anything I've ever heard before. They didn't stick around to investigate. They threw their stuff in Chris's truck and drove out of there, spending the night at a motel in Upper Lake. The next morning, against my advice, they went back to check out the site in daylight. What they found was the birch tree snapped halfway up the trunk, not uprooted or blown over by wind, snapped clean with splintered wood still fresh and damp. Mark sent me photos. The break was about 8 feet off the ground, way too high for a bear to reach standing on its hind legs, and there were no claw marks on the trunk, no bear scat, no tracks in the soft ground around it. Maybe it was damaged before and just fell while you were there, I suggested when Mark showed me the pictures. The wood was fresh, Ryan, he insisted. It happened right when we heard it. And what about the growl? I didn't have an answer for that. Neither did he. By this point, I was getting genuinely spooked about the area, but tried to rationalize it. Northern California forests are full of wildlife. Bears, mountain lions, even the occasional aggressive elk. Weird things happen in the wilderness. That's what I kept telling myself. Then came strike 3, and the one that hit closest to home, because I experienced it myself. It was early October, turkey hunting season. I'd gone out alone to a spot about 10 miles north of Lake Pillsbury, near Bass Otter Creek. It's a good area for wild turkey, secluded and quiet. I'd been sitting in my blind since dawn, but hadn't seen much movement. Around 11 in the morning, it started to rain, one of those sudden, heavy downpours that sometimes hit in the fall. I pulled on my poncho and decided to wait it out under a thick cedar tree rather than pack up completely. The rain was loud, drumming against the leaves and the ground, but oddly soothing. I was half dozing, my shotgun across my lap, when something changed. It's hard to explain if you haven't spent a lot of time in the woods, but there's a feeling you get when something's not right. The air feels different, charged somehow. That's what happened. I suddenly felt wide awake, every nerve in my body on high alert. Then I smelled it. God, that smell. It hit me like a physical wall, this overwhelming stench of sweat, rotting meat, and wet fur all mixed together. It was so strong I actually gagged. My first thought was dead animal, but this was different. There was something alive about the smell, something utterly wild. At the same time, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even rain dripping from leaves, just absolute suffocating silence. Then I heard it, a heavy footstep behind me, not the quick patter of a deer or the shuffling of a bear, a deliberate heavy step, followed by silence. Then another. Whatever it was moving slowly, carefully. One step, pause, another step. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps continued, circling around to my right, still in the thick brush where I couldn't see. Clutching my shotgun, I slowly stood up. I'm not proud to admit it, but in that moment, I wasn't thinking about getting a look at whatever was out there. I was thinking about getting back to my truck as fast as possible without turning my back on the sound. I started backing away, eyes fixed on the brush where the footsteps had been. As I moved, it moved too, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, it stopped. When I took a step, it took a step. This went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. The whole time, that smell hung in the air, so thick I could taste it. And there was something else, a sense of being watched, studied. I never saw eyes, never saw movement in the brush, but I knew something was staring at me, something intelligent. I kept backing up until I hit the trail that led back to the fire road where I'd parked. Once on more open ground, I turned and walked quickly, fighting the urge to run. Running triggers predators. Every hunter knows that. So I forced myself to walk steadily, listening intently. The footsteps followed, always keeping to the dense brush alongside the trail, always matching my pace, always just out of sight. When my truck finally came into view, I broke into a sprint, fumbling with my keys as I ran. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I started the engine, I finally looked directly at the tree line where the footsteps had been following me. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, something large shifting in the shadows, but it could have been the wind or my imagination working overtime. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell, not stopping until I hit the main highway. I haven't been back to that spot since. Look, I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or any other mythical creature. I never saw anything clearly enough to make that claim. But I know what I experienced. Rocks hitting our boat from shore, a tree snapped at an impossible height with no explanation, and something large and unknown pacing me through the woods. These days, when people talk about Bigfoot being just a campfire tale, I nod and keep quiet. I don't try to convince anyone. But I know what I know, and I've learned an important lesson. Some places you just leave alone. Lake Pillsbury and the surrounding woods, that's one of those places for me now. Whatever's out there, it made its point. 3 strikes and I'm out. Story 13. I've been holding this experience in for decades, but after finding this community and reading similar accounts, I think I'm finally ready to share what happened to my brother and me back in '87. It was mid-July 1987. My younger brother Nathan and I were on a backpacking trip along the High Sierra Trail in California. We were both in our 20s then. I was 26, Nathan 23, and we'd been planning this trip for months. Nathan had just finished college, and this was our way of celebrating before he started his first real job. By the 3rd day, we were absolutely beat. We'd hiked from Bear Paw Meadow, gone over the summit, and down into the Kern River Valley. 18 miles that day alone. My legs felt like lead, and my shoulders were raw from the straps of my pack. Nathan was in better shape than me, but even he was dragging his feet by late afternoon. The strangest part of that day was how isolated we felt. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail all day, not a single hiker. In July, that was unusual, especially for such a popular trail. But we were grateful for the solitude. The Sierra Nevada is beautiful when you have it all to yourself. We made camp at Moraine Lake, this gorgeous alpine lake sitting high above the Kern River Valley. The elevation was around 9,000 feet, if I remember correctly. It was one of those perfect Sierra evenings, crisp air, clear skies, and that golden light hitting the mountain peaks. We were too exhausted to properly appreciate it, though. We just wanted to eat and crash. After setting up our tent, we boiled water on our tiny camp stove for some freeze-dried lasagna. The sun was setting, and dusk was settling in. The mountains were turning that deep purple color they get just before dark. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. That's when we heard it. I've spent years trying to find the right words to describe this sound, but nothing quite captures it. It was a scream, no, more like a howl, but with this bizarre, unearthly quality that made the hair on my arm stand up instantly. It was loud, so impossibly loud that it seemed to fill the entire valley. Nathan and I both froze mid-bite. Our eyes locked, and I could see my own fear reflected in his face. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." The sound came again, this prolonged, haunting cry that seemed to come from something with enormous lungs. It wasn't abrupt like a coyote or wolf howl. It started low, rose to this blood-curdling peak, and then gradually trailed off. The echo bounced off the mountains around us, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but it was definitely some distance away. Here's what I know for certain. It wasn't human. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard in my years of hiking and camping. Bears make a woofing sound when alarmed, or they might growl or roar, but this wasn't that. Cougars can scream, but this was deeper, more resonant, with this strange, almost sad quality to it. Not aggressive, but mournful. I'd been backpacking in the Sierras since I was a teenager. I knew what elk sounded like during rutting season. I knew coyote calls and owl hoots and all the normal night sounds of the mountains. This was something else entirely. "Maybe it's someone messing around," Nathan suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Who would be out here, miles from any trailhead, screaming their lungs out at dusk, and how could any human produce a sound with that much volume and that particular timbre? We sat there frozen, our dinner cooling in our laps, straining to hear if it would come again. A minute passed. 2 minutes. 5, nothing but the growing darkness and the soft lapping of water against the lakeshore. "Should we, I don't know, investigate?" Nathan asked. I considered it for about half a second. We were exhausted. It was getting dark, and whatever made that sound was some distance away. Plus, if I'm being honest, a part of me didn't want to know what could make a sound like that. "No way," I said. "We're both dead on our feet. Let's just finish eating and get some sleep." Nathan nodded, looking relieved. We finished our meal in silence, both of us frequently stopping to listen. The sound never came again that night. We secured our food in bear canisters, crawled into our sleeping bags, and somehow, despite the adrenaline still coursing through our systems, we fell asleep almost immediately. That's how tired we were. The next morning, the incident seemed less significant in the bright light of day. We briefly discussed what we might have heard. A mountain lion was our best guess, though neither of us was convinced, then packed up and continued our hike. The rest of our trip was uneventful, beautiful Sierra Nevada backcountry hiking with no strange encounters or sounds. When we got back to civilization 5 days later, I honestly had mostly forgotten about the weird howl. We had covered nearly 60 miles of trail, seen some incredible scenery, and that one strange moment at Moraine Lake had faded into the background. Then I saw the newspaper. I was at a cafe in 3 Rivers, waiting for Nathan to finish up in the restroom before we drove back to San Francisco. There was a copy of the local paper on the table, and I was absent-mindedly flipping through it when a small article caught my eye. The headline read, "Forest Service workers report Bigfoot sighting in Kern River Valley." I nearly spit out my coffee. I started reading, my heart pounding harder with each sentence. According to the article, 3 men working for the U.S. Forest Service had been repairing a footbridge in the Golden Trout Wilderness area of the Kern River when they encountered what they described as a 9-foot-tall hairy creature. These weren't some random hikers or tourists. They were experienced woodsmen, including a 60-year-old Mono Indian who had spent his entire life in these mountains. The men reported that they were working on the bridge when they heard crashing sounds coming from the hillside above them. Then this massive creature came screaming down the hillside toward them. They were so frightened that one of them fired a warning shot from a .30-06 rifle, which caused the creature to flee. What made my blood run cold was the date of the incident. It was the exact same day Nathan and I had heard that strange howl at Moraine Lake. I quickly checked a map when I got home. The Golden Trout Wilderness is in the same general area where we'd been camping. Based on the location mentioned in the article, I estimated that these Forest Service workers were somewhere between 5 and 8 miles from our campsite at Moraine Lake. 5 to 8 miles. That's not that far when you're dealing with a sound that powerful, and the timing matched perfectly. The article went on to say that the men had reported the incident to their supervisor, a ranger who was skeptical but agreed to accompany them back to the site the next day. They found large footprints in the gravel, though the soil was too loose for proper casting. I showed the article to Nathan as soon as he returned to the table. He read it twice, then looked at me with wide eyes. "You think?" he started. "I don't know what to think," I said honestly. "But the timing and location, it's one hell of a coincidence." We debated telling someone about what we'd heard, but who would we tell, and what would we say? Hey, we heard a weird noise that might have been related to a Bigfoot sighting reported by some Forest Service guys. It seemed pointless, so we kept it to ourselves. For years, actually, I would occasionally bring it up with Nathan when we got together, but we never reached any satisfying conclusion. We'd both grown up hearing Bigfoot stories. It's almost a requirement when you spend time in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest and California, but neither of us had ever given them much credence. After this experience, though, I don't know. I'm still not saying I believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it, but I know what I heard that evening at Moraine Lake. I know it wasn't normal. And I know that 3 men with decades of wilderness experience between them were scared enough by something to fire a warning shot from a high-powered rifle. Over the years, I've researched other reported Bigfoot vocalizations. Some of the recordings I found online sound somewhat similar to what we heard. These long, mournful howls that seem too powerful to come from any known animal, but nothing quite captures it. You had to be there, in that valley, with that sound echoing all around you, to truly understand how unnerving it was. I've gone back to the Sierra Nevada many times since then. I've even camped at Moraine Lake again. Never heard anything like it since. Part of me hopes I never do, but another part of me wishes for some kind of confirmation, some proof that what we experienced was real, and not just some strange acoustic phenomenon or an animal call distorted by mountain echoes. Nathan and I still talk about it sometimes. He's more skeptical than I am, more likely to attribute it to a known animal or some kind of weird atmospheric condition. But even he admits that nothing in his experience before or since has quite matched what we heard that evening. I don't know what to make of it all, honestly. Was that sound we heard the same creature that frightened those Forest Service workers? If so, what exactly was it? I can't say for sure. All I know is that for a few minutes on a summer evening in 1987, my entire understanding of what exists in our wilderness was called into question. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I still hear that howl in my mind, that long, lonely cry echoing through the mountains, and I wonder what exactly was out there with us in the Sierra Nevada. Story 14. I still get chills thinking about what happened that night in the Honey Island swamp. It's been almost 8 months, but I can't shake it. I've been going back and forth about posting this, but I need to tell someone who might understand or who's seen something similar. My girlfriend Amber and I often take late-night drives through the Stennis Space Center buffer zone near the Honey Island swamp. It's this huge abandoned area that NASA repurposed for Apollo rocket testing back in the 60s. Most people think it's creepy, but for me, it's home in a way. My family's roots go back centuries in this area. My great-grandfather used to trap and fish these swamps, and my grandfather told me stories about growing up in what he called the last wild place in Mississippi. That night, January 18th, was unusually cold for the Gulf Coast. The temperature had dropped to the mid-30s, and a light fog was rolling in over the low areas. It was around midnight, and we were driving down one of those scenic roads lined with massive live oak trees. These aren't your regular trees. They're ancient, with huge branches that stretch out like arms over the road, draped in Spanish moss. In the headlights, they cast these weird, shifting shadows. We weren't talking much, just listening to some old Creedence Clearwater revival and enjoying the drive. The moon was nearly full, which lit up the fog in this eerie blue glow. That's when we both noticed it at the same time, a single point of eyeshine about 150 feet ahead, positioned in the fork of one of the biggest oak trees. "You see that?" Amber asked, gripping my arm. I nodded, slowing the truck down. The eyeshine was about 8 feet off the ground, nestled in where the massive trunk split into 2 main branches. At first, I thought it was probably a great horned owl. They're common in the swamp, and they have that distinctive yellow-orange eyeshine. I pulled the truck closer, angling the headlights toward the tree to get a better look. That's when something happened that made my stomach drop. The eye moved slightly to the left, then ducked completely out of sight, before reappearing a second later. It wasn't the movement itself that bothered me, it was the arc of the movement. An owl turning its head would make a different motion. This moved like someone leaning out from behind the tree to look at us, then ducking back when they realized we'd spotted them. "That's not an animal," Amber whispered. "It's too big." I felt this sudden cold sensation wash over me that had nothing to do with the January chill. I reached under my seat and grabbed my high-powered flashlight, one of those 600 lumen tactical ones that can light up a field. When I aimed it at the tree, the beam cut through the fog and illuminated the fork. There was still only one bright amber eye visible, reflecting the light back at us. The rest remained hidden in the shadows behind the massive trunk. It didn't blink or move away from the light like an animal would. It just watched us. "Hello?" I called out, wondering if it might be a hunter or someone camping illegally. My voice seemed to disappear into the fog. No response. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes, neither of us wanting to get out of the truck. The eye remained fixed on us the entire time, occasionally shifting position slightly, but never disappearing for long. "Let's drive past it," Amber suggested. "We can turn around and come back. Maybe we'll see it better from the other direction." I nodded and put the truck in drive, moving slowly forward. As we got closer, the eye finally disappeared behind the trunk. We drove past the tree, and I watched it in my side mirror, but saw nothing. About a quarter-mile down, I found a wide spot to turn around. Coming back, we both stared at the tree, but there was nothing there. No eyeshine, no movement. Whatever had been watching us was gone. This wasn't the first weird experience I've had in these woods. About 3 years ago, Amber and I were in almost the same spot when everything just went silent. I mean completely silent. No frogs, no crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. We both felt this intense sensation of being watched, like there were eyes on us from every direction. It lasted maybe 20 minutes before the normal swamp sounds gradually returned. But this was different. This was direct contact. When we got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that single amber eye in my mind, the way it moved with such purpose. Whatever was watching us was big, much bigger than any owl or raccoon, and it was standing on 2 legs behind that tree. I'm certain of it. My grandfather used to tell stories about the swamp people that lived deep in Honey Island. Most folks write them off as local legends, stories about the Honey Island swamp monster to scare tourists. But my grandfather wasn't one for tall tales. When he talked about things he'd seen in the swamp, there was always this seriousness in his voice. He'd lower it almost to a whisper and say, "The woods have eyes, Michael. Always remember that." The next morning, I went back to that spot alone. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but I needed to see it in daylight. The tree was even bigger than I remembered, at least 4 feet in diameter with a perfect fork, about 8 feet up, where someone or something could easily stand or sit. Looking around the base, I noticed something odd. The typical leaf litter and small plants that covered the ground everywhere else were cleared in a rough circle around the tree, like something had been walking around it repeatedly. I looked for footprints, but the ground was too hard and dry to show any clear impressions. But as I was about to leave, I spotted something caught in the rough bark about 7 feet up. A tuft of hair. It was dark brown or black, coarse and about 3 inches long. Too high up for a deer or hog, and not the right texture for a bear. Not that there have been bears in this area for decades. I took the hair home and examined it under an old microscope I had from college. It didn't look like any animal hair I was familiar with. It was thicker than human hair, but had a similar structure. I still have it in a plastic bag in my desk drawer. I've spent most of my life in these swamps. I know every sound, every animal track, every normal thing you might encounter out there. What we saw that night wasn't normal. The way it moved was almost curious, like it was as interested in us as we were in it. I've done some research since then. There are stories from all over this region about tall, hair-covered figures seen at night. Most people laugh them off, but the old-timers, especially those with Native American ancestry, take them seriously. They talk about forest people that have lived in the deep swamps since before Europeans arrived. My great-grandmother was part Choctaw, and she used to tell my grandfather stories about creatures she called Kowi Anukasha, the forest dwellers. According to her, they weren't malevolent, just private and fiercely territorial. They were said to be curious about humans, but avoided direct contact. Since that January night, I've been back to that road many times, always hoping and dreading that I might see that eye again. Part of me wants confirmation that I'm not crazy, that what we saw was real. Another part of me is terrified of what that confirmation might mean. The thing that keeps bothering me is how deliberate the movement seemed. Whatever was watching us wasn't just some animal reacting instinctively. It was studying us, hiding when it realized we'd spotted it, then cautiously looking out again. That suggests intelligence, purpose. A few weeks after our encounter, I mentioned it to my uncle, who's worked as a wildlife officer in the area for 30 years. I expected him to laugh it off, but instead, he got really quiet and asked me exactly where we'd been. When I told him, he nodded like I'd confirmed something he already suspected. That section of road has had more strange reports than anywhere else in the buffer zone, he finally said. Mostly from hunters. They talk about feeling watched, finding their tree stands disturbed. A couple years ago, a guy came in white as a sheet saying something had walked beneath his stand in the pre-dawn darkness. Something big that walked on 2 legs, but definitely wasn't human. I asked him what he thought it was, and he just shrugged. I'm a scientific guy, Michael. I deal in what I can prove, but I've worked these woods for 3 decades, and there are things I can't explain. Things I've seen myself that don't fit what's supposed to be out there. That's where I'm at now. I can't explain what we saw that night. I just know that whatever was watching us from that tree was big, intelligent, and as curious about us as we were about it. It was something that seemed to belong to the swamp in a way that even I, with my family's long history here, never will. Sometimes when I'm driving those roads at night, I find myself scanning the trees, looking for that amber eye. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think something is looking back. Story 15. I've been debating whether to share this for years. Not because I don't remember it clearly, I do all too vividly, but because I know how it sounds. The thing is, I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. I just need to put this somewhere because it's been gnawing at me for decades now. And the older I get, the more I feel like someone should know what happened. It all started back in the winter of '67. I was just a kid, maybe 8 years old at the time. We lived in this modest house at the edge of Otis, Massachusetts, nestled right up against a steep wooded hill that seemed like a mountain to my young eyes. It was the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody, where kids could play outside until dinner without parents worrying too much. That winter was particularly harsh. We'd had several big snowstorms back to back, and this one morning I woke up to find everything blanketed in about 14 inches of fresh powder. As a kid, that was like hitting the jackpot. No school, sledding all day, snowball fights with my siblings. I remember rushing through breakfast, barely tasting my oatmeal as I stared out the kitchen window at all that pristine white, already planning my day. But something was off. Mom was standing at the back door, just staring out at the yard with this strange expression. Dad was out there, trudging through the snow, looking at something on the ground. I remember he kept turning around to look up at the hill behind our house, then back down at whatever he was examining. "Go finish your breakfast, William," Mom said when she noticed me watching. Her voice had this tight quality I wasn't used to hearing. Of course, being a curious kid, I ignored her and slipped past to see what was happening. That's when I saw them, the tracks. They came straight down from the hill, cutting a perfect line through the untouched snow. But these weren't deer tracks or rabbit prints. They were footprints, human-shaped footprints. Except they weren't human, not really. They were massive, easily twice the size of my dad's boots, and he was a big man with size 13 feet. The stride between them was impossibly wide too, like whatever made them could step twice as far as a grown man. "Dad?" I remember asking. "Who made those?" He just shook his head, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "Don't know, son, don't know. The tracks led right up to our back porch, right up to our house. Like whatever made them had walked down that steep, densely wooded hill in the middle of the night, approached our home, and then... What? Just stood there looking in?" The thought made my stomach feel hollow. I'll never forget what happened next. Dad followed the tracks back to where they started at the tree line, then tried to follow them up the hill. He came back 20 minutes later, red-faced and breathing hard. "Whoever it is, they went straight up that hill like it was nothing," he told Mom, not realizing I was listening from the hallway. "That's a 45-degree slope in some spots. I couldn't even follow the whole way without slipping down." Mom gathered us all in the living room after that. "Nobody's playing outside today," she announced, her tone making it clear this wasn't up for debate, and the hill is off limits for a long time. The way she said it, not angry but afraid, scared me more than the footprints themselves. We never talked about it openly after that day. Life went on. I grew up, moved away for college, got a job in Boston. The tracks became one of those childhood memories that fade around the edges, but never completely disappear. Occasionally I'd wonder about them, especially during winter visits home, but I never saw anything like them again, until I did. It was 1992, early November. I was 33, visiting my parents for the weekend. Mom had passed 2 years earlier, cancer, and Dad was pushing 70, still living alone in the same house. I tried to visit every few weeks, worried about him being by himself out there, though he'd never admit to needing company. That particular night we'd stayed up late talking. Dad had always been the quiet type, but in his later years he'd opened up more. We were sitting on the porch swing around 11 at night. It was cold, but not unbearable, and there was something peaceful about being out there with the stars so bright overhead, the kind of clear sky you never get in the city. Dad had gone quiet, maybe dozing a little, and I was just sitting there listening to the wind in the trees when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the woods on the hill behind the house. At first I thought it might be a deer, but these weren't the light, quick steps of a deer. These were slow, methodical, powerful. The sound of branches breaking occasionally punctuated the footfalls. Whatever it was big, and it was coming down the hill. I remember sitting up straighter, every muscle in my body tensing. "Dad," I whispered, not wanting to startle him. "Dad, do you hear that?" He stirred but shook his head. His hearing had deteriorated over the years, and the sound wasn't loud enough for him to pick up. But I heard it, clear as day. The footsteps continued steadily down the hill, following almost exactly the same path as those tracks from 25 years earlier. I could chart the progress by sound, halfway down the hill, then closer, then at the edge of the yard where the trees stopped, and then they stopped too. Whatever it was had reached the tree line and was just standing there. In the darkness, beyond our yard lights, I couldn't see anything. The shadows under those trees were too deep, but I felt it, felt something watching us. For what seemed like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Then came a sound I still can't adequately describe, a sort of shuffling side-to-side movement, like something shifting its weight back and forth. Not nervously but deliberately, like it was considering something. Dad must have sensed my tension. "What is it?" he asked, squinting into the darkness. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up, because in that moment I knew, absolutely knew, that whatever had left those tracks in the snow when I was 8 years old was back. And it was standing right there at the edge of our property, hidden in shadow, looking at us. Then it turned around. I heard it clearly, the pivot of a heavy body. And then the footsteps began again, this time moving away, back up the hill. Steady, powerful steps, climbing that steep slope like it was nothing. No flashlight beam bouncing among the trees, no voice calling out, no sound of labored breathing you'd expect from someone tackling that climb in the dark. Just those footsteps, growing fainter as whatever it was made its way back up and over the hill. When I finally found my voice, I turned to Dad. "Did you ever figure out what made those tracks back in '67? He looked at me strangely. "What made you think of that now?" I couldn't tell him, couldn't explain that the thing that had terrified us decades ago had just paid us another visit. He would have either not believed me or worried himself sick about living alone so close to the woods. "Just wondering," I said. He shook his head. "Some things don't have explanations, Will. Some things you just live with." I didn't sleep at all that night. Kept thinking about those tracks in the snow and those heavy footsteps. No human would attempt that hill at night without a reason. Even in daylight, it was a challenging climb. I'd tried it countless times as a teenager, and no human could have navigated it in complete darkness, without a light, without making sounds of exertion. Next morning, I walked to the tree line and searched for evidence, but the ground was too hard, covered in fallen leaves that showed no clear prints. Part of me was relieved. That was the last time I heard it, but not the last time I thought about it. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, always with a mixture of skepticism and that nagging feeling of recognition. The descriptions of how they move, the massive stride, the ability to navigate difficult terrain effortlessly, it all matches what I experienced. Dad passed away 5 years after that night. The house was sold to a young family from New York. Sometimes I wonder if they've heard the footsteps or found strange tracks in their yard after a snowfall. Sometimes I think about warning them, but what would I say? Oh, by the way, something not quite human visits occasionally, walks right up to the house, then leaves. So I keep it to myself. This strange connection to something I can't explain. I'm convinced now that whatever it wasn't dangerous, at least not to us. It had 25 years to do us harm, and never did. It just checked in from time to time, like it was curious, like it remembered us the same way we remembered it. I'm 59 now. I've told this story exactly twice, once to my wife, who listened patiently, but clearly didn't believe me. And now here. I don't blame anyone for doubting. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But here's the thing about those woods in Otis, Massachusetts. Something lives there. Something that walks on 2 legs, but isn't human. Something that navigates steep terrain in complete darkness. Something that remembers. And sometimes on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams, coming down the hill toward the house. Steady, purposeful, familiar. Story 16. This happened back in the summer of '82. Tom and I had been married just under 2 years, and we'd moved to the Lake George area because Tom got a job with the forestry department. We loved hiking and spent most weekends exploring different trails. That Saturday in July was hot, but not unbearable. Maybe 75 degrees with that thick humidity that hangs in the Adirondack air. We decided to hike Prospect Mountain, but not the main trail that all the tourists use. Tom knew about this old ranger road that wound up the backside of the mountain. It wasn't maintained or marked on any public maps. But being with the forestry department, Tom had access to all these insider spots. He said it would be more peaceful, and he was right about that part. We parked our old Subaru at this unmarked pull-off about half a mile from the official trailhead. The path looked more like a wide game trail than a road, with tall grass growing between two tire tracks. It was beautiful though, dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, the smell of pine and moss, birds singing. Looking back, it's hard to believe something so unsettling could happen in a place that felt so peaceful. The hike up was uneventful. We saw a couple of deer, a woodpecker, the usual wildlife. Tom kept walking ahead like he always did, something that normally just annoyed me a little, but would later make me furious. I'd gotten used to his faster pace, and typically just kept him in sight about 50 yards ahead. We reached the summit around 4 in the afternoon. The view was incredible. You could see the entirety of Lake George stretching north to south, the islands dotting the water like little green jewels. We sat on some rocks, ate our sandwiches, took some photos with our old Canon camera. Everything was completely normal. We started our descent around 5:30. I remember checking my watch because I mentioned to Tom that we should pick up the pace to make sure we got back before dark. The sun wouldn't set until around 8:30, but the forest gets dark early, especially on the east side of a mountain. About 20 minutes into our descent, that's when I first noticed something felt off. The forest had gotten quieter, not completely silent, that came later, but the bird songs had thinned out. Tom was about 40 yards ahead of me, moving quickly down the path. I called for him to slow down, and he waved without looking back, but did slow his pace slightly. That's when I heard it the first time. A cracking sound from the woods to my right, maybe 30 feet in from the path. I stopped, thinking it was probably a deer. When I stopped, the sound stopped too. I stood still for maybe 5 seconds, then started walking again. The sound resumed, careful, deliberate steps keeping pace with mine. "Tom," I called out, "I think there's something following us." He turned around, annoyed at first, then saw the look on my face. "Probably just a deer," he said, but waited for me to catch up. We walked together for about 10 minutes, and I started to relax, thinking maybe I had imagined it. Then Tom stopped suddenly, putting his arm out in front of me. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. The footsteps had returned, still to our right, still keeping perfect pace with us, but now they sounded heavier, more deliberate, and there was something else. A sort of huffing sound, like something breathing through its nose, trying to catch our scent. "It's just a bear," Tom said, but his voice had that forced confidence that told me he wasn't convinced. "Let's keep moving. Make some noise." We started walking again, faster now, talking loudly about random things, the weather, what we'd have for dinner, anything to sound human and discourage wildlife. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was getting darker by the minute. The footsteps kept pace with us, sometimes falling slightly behind, then catching up with a series of quicker movements. Whatever it was big enough to make substantial noise moving through the underbrush, but somehow managed to stay completely out of sight. I never once caught even a glimpse of what was following us, not even a shadow or movement in the trees. After about half an hour of this, the forest fell completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots on the path and those steady footsteps keeping pace with us from the tree line. That's when the fear really set in. That unnatural silence that seems to press against your ears. The sun was nearly gone now, just a faint glow behind the mountains. Tom had his small flashlight out, the beam barely cutting through the growing darkness. I kept glancing to my right, straining to see through the trees, but it was just shadows within shadows. "Tom," I whispered, gripping his arm, "what if it's not a bear?" "What else would it be?" he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I don't know, but bears don't stalk people like this. They make noise, they crash through things. This feels calculated." That's the word that kept coming to mind, calculated. Whatever was following us was doing it with purpose, with intelligence. It knew exactly how far to stay in the trees, to remain unseen. It knew to stop when we stopped, to move when we moved. There was strategy in its movements that no ordinary animal would display. About 3/4 of the way down, Tom decided to try something. "Let's stop here for a minute," he whispered. "Just stand completely still and listen." We stopped in the middle of the path. The footsteps stopped too, exactly as they had before. We stood in silence for nearly 2 minutes. Nothing moved. Then Tom suddenly clapped his hands loudly, 3 sharp claps that echoed through the trees. The silence that followed was absolute. No response, no movement, but I swear I could feel it watching us, waiting to see what we would do next. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to run. "Let's go," I whispered. "Please, let's just go." We started walking again, faster now, almost jogging. The footsteps returned immediately, keeping perfect pace, sometimes getting closer to the edge of the trees. At one point, Tom shined his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only penetrated about 15 feet into the dense forest. Whatever was there remained hidden just beyond the reach of the light. The most terrifying moment came when we reached a bend in the path. As the trail curved to the left, the footsteps didn't immediately follow the curve. Instead, they continued straight for a few seconds, then stopped. There was a moment of silence. Then we heard movement rapidly cutting through the forest, taking a direct route to intercept the path ahead of us. "It's cutting us off," I gasped, grabbing Tom's arm so hard my knuckles went white. "Run," Tom said, and we did. We sprinted down that path in near darkness, Tom's flashlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating the trail just enough to keep us from tripping. I expected at any moment to hear those footsteps burst from the trees ahead of us, to finally see what had been stalking us. But instead, the sounds returned to our right side, keeping pace even as we ran. The intelligence behind those movements is what haunts me the most. Whatever it wasn't just randomly moving through the forest. It was deliberately following us, studying us, perhaps even herding us. It maintained the perfect distance, close enough to let us know it was there, but far enough to remain concealed. We finally reached the car after what felt like hours. I fumbled with the keys while Tom kept the flashlight trained on the forest edge. The footsteps had stopped when we reached the clearing where the car was parked. As I finally got the door unlocked, I looked back toward the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A darker shadow among the trees, taller than it should have been. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure it wasn't just my terrified mind playing tricks on me. We jumped in the car, locked the doors, and I turned the key with shaking hands. As the headlights came on, they illuminated the tree line, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness beyond. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We had no explanation for what had happened. Tom suggested it might have been a bear, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew bears don't behave that way. Years later, around 1986, I was working at the library in Glens Falls when I came across a local newspaper clipping about some teenagers who had reported strange sightings near French Mountain between 81 and 83. French Mountain is only about 5 miles from Prospect Mountain. The article didn't give many details, just that the teens had reported seeing something tall and dark moving through the woods at dusk. I felt a chill reading those words. The timing matched up perfectly with our experience. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was another hiker playing a prank. Though how they could have maintained that perfect stealth for over an hour in the growing darkness, I can't explain. Maybe it was nothing but our own fear amplifying normal forest sounds, but deep down, I know something intelligent was tracking us that evening. Something that understood the concept of pursuit, of remaining hidden, of psychological intimidation. Something that wanted us to know it was there without allowing us to see it. I've never gone back to that Ranger Road, and Tom and I eventually moved away from the area. We rarely talk about what happened that day, but sometimes I'll catch him staring into the woods with a wary expression, and I know he's remembering too. Whatever was in those woods 40 years ago, it changed how I see forests forever. I still hike, but never alone, and never as dusk approaches, and I always have the feeling that something might be just beyond the tree line, matching my pace, step for step, watching and waiting. Story 17. I still don't know what to make of what happened last January. I've kept quiet about it for months because I know how crazy it sounds. But I need to get this off my chest. I was home for winter break from college, staying at my parents' place in rural Pennsylvania. We'd gotten about 8 inches of fresh snow the night before, the fluffy kind that makes everything look like a postcard. I'd been inside all morning, just lounging around and catching up on some reading. Around noon, my mom called for me from the front door. There was something strange in her voice that made me put my book down immediately. Not panic exactly, but a kind of controlled urgency that parents get when something's not right. "Come look at this," she said when I got to the door. She was standing on the porch, still wearing her slippers, pointing toward the yard. "Tell me I'm not seeing things." When I stepped out beside her, I didn't notice anything at first, just our front yard covered in pristine snow. Then I followed where she was pointing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. But not normal footprints. These were enormous, and they weren't boot prints either. They were clearly defined impressions of bare feet, complete with toe shapes. "What the hell?" I said, stepping off the porch to get a closer look. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the nearest print. When I stood over it, I felt my stomach drop. It was at least 3 times the size of my own foot. "My mom came up behind me. I noticed them when I went to get the mail," she said. "They go all around the house." I knelt down beside one of the prints. The impression was deep, maybe 3 or 4 inches into the snow, and incredibly clear. I could make out 5 distinct toes, a broad forefoot and a well-defined heel. It looked exactly like a human footprint, just massive. "Do you have a tape measure?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the print. Mom went back inside and returned with my dad's carpenter's tape. I pulled it out and laid it alongside one of the clearer prints. The measurement shocked me, between 15 and 18 inches from heel to toe. I measured a few more to be sure, and they were all consistent. The width at the ball of the foot was around 8 inches. I wear a size 10 shoe, and these prints made mine look like a child's. "Should we call someone?" my mom asked. She'd wrapped her arms around herself, even though she was wearing a thick sweater. I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from nerves. "Let's follow them first," I said. "See where they go." We started tracking the prints from the front yard. They formed a single line, with a stride length that was almost comical. I measured the distance between consecutive left-right steps, about 3 feet apart. That's an enormous stride for anyone, let alone someone walking through 8 inches of fresh snow. What made it even more bizarre was that whoever or whatever made these prints was barefoot, in January, in freezing temperatures. Who walks barefoot through snow in the dead of winter? The trail led us around the side of the house, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A few days earlier, I'd walked through the woods behind our house, breaking a trail through the untouched snow. The new footprints directly overlapped my own in several places, as if whatever made them had deliberately followed my path. As we continued following the tracks into the backyard, I noticed how they seemed to meander around, not in a straight line, but more like something that was exploring or searching. They circled around trees, approached the back of the house, then moved away again. Look how deep they are, my mom said, pointing to a particularly well-defined print. Whatever made these must be incredibly heavy. She was right. The snow was compacted firmly at the bottom of each print, much more than my own footprints nearby. Whatever left these tracks had to weigh at least twice what I did, maybe more. The tracks continued all the way around our property, front yard, side yard, backyard, creating a complete circuit. They eventually led to the edge of the tree line that marked the beginning of the dense forest behind our house. There, the footprints disappeared into the brush and undergrowth. Mom and I stood at the edge of the woods, staring at where the tracks vanished. Neither of us suggested following them into the trees. Something about those massive bare footprints disappearing into the dark woods made my heart race. I'm not usually one to get spooked easily, but this felt different. When do you think this happened? I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my mouth had gone dry. Mom shook her head. Must have been last night or early this morning. The snow stopped around midnight, and I was up at 7. These weren't here then. I looked back at the house, suddenly aware of how exposed we were standing at the forest's edge. So whatever made these was walking around our house while we were all sleeping. The thought sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. We went back inside, and I told my dad about what we'd found. He's a practical man, always looking for logical explanations, but even he seemed unsettled when we showed him the prints. He took some photos with his phone, measuring tape laid beside the footprints for scale. Could be a prank, he suggested, but didn't sound convinced, someone with fake feet attachments or something. But that didn't make sense. The prints were too perfect, too natural in their movement patterns. Each one showed the subtle weight distribution of a real foot, heavier at the heel and ball, lighter at the arch, and who would walk around our isolated property in the middle of the night, in freezing temperatures, wearing fake feet. Plus, there was only one set of tracks. No human footprints approaching or leaving alongside them. If someone had played a prank, where were their actual footprints? I spent the rest of the day researching online. Bigfoot sightings weren't common in our area, but they weren't unheard of either. There had been reports over the years from hikers and campers in the state forest about 10 miles from our house. Most people dismissed them as bear sightings or hoaxes, but after what I'd seen that morning, I wasn't so quick to judge. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those footprints circling our house, about whatever had made them standing outside, maybe looking in through the windows while we slept. I got up several times to check that the doors and windows were locked. The next morning, I went out early to look at the tracks again. Overnight, the temperature had risen just enough to slightly melt the top layer of snow before freezing again, preserving the footprints almost perfectly. They were still there, unmistakable and impossible to explain away. I decided to follow the tracks into the woods. In daylight, with the winter sun filtering through the bare trees, it didn't seem as intimidating. I told my parents where I was going and grabbed a walking stick from the garage, more for comfort than protection. The tracks were harder to follow in the woods. They weaved between trees and sometimes disappeared where the snow hadn't penetrated the thick canopy. But I could still make out the general direction, heading deeper into the forest, toward the hills behind our property. About half a mile in, I noticed something strange. The creature had stopped at a certain point and appeared to have stood still for some time. The snow was heavily compacted there, with what looked like knuckle impressions on either side, as if it had crouched down or leaned forward on its hands. Right in front of this spot was a small clearing where I'd set up a game camera 3 months earlier. I'd placed it there hoping to capture footage of the deer that frequented the area. I'd completely forgotten about it until that moment. My heart raced as I approached the tree where the camera was mounted. It was still there, but when I checked it, I discovered the camera had been turned to face the tree trunk. Not removed or damaged, just deliberately turned away, as if whatever had made those footprints knew exactly what the device was and how to disable it without destroying it. That's when I heard it, a deep, low sound from somewhere deeper in the forest, Not quite a growl, not quite a groan, but something in between. It was brief, just a few seconds, but loud enough to carry through the winter air. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound hadn't been close, maybe a few hundred yards away, but it was unlike anything I'd ever heard in these woods before. Not a bear, not a deer, not any animal I could identify. I stood absolutely still, straining to hear it again. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the occasional sound of snow falling from branches. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, I heard a branch snap, far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint the direction. Then another, slightly closer. I didn't wait to hear a third. I turned and headed back toward the house, walking quickly but trying not to run. Running feels like surrender, like confirming your prey. But with every step, I felt the urge to sprint growing stronger. About halfway back, I heard another branch break, this time much closer behind me. That's when I abandoned all pretense and ran, stumbling through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded the air in front of me. I burst out of the tree line into our backyard, not stopping until I reached the back door. Only then did I turn to look back at the woods. Nothing was there. Just the silent, snow-covered trees and the trail of my own panicked footprints leading back into the forest. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I didn't tell my parents about what I'd heard. They were already unsettled enough by the footprints. I didn't want to add to their worry. We never did figure out what made those tracks. The weather warmed up the next day, turning the snow to slush and erasing all evidence. My dad contacted a friend who works for the state wildlife agency, but by the time he came out to look, there was nothing left to see except our photographs, which he dismissed as interesting but inconclusive. It's been 6 months now, and I've told myself 100 different explanations for what happened that day. Maybe it was a prank, or some hiker with custom-made snowshoes, or some kind of animal I'm not familiar with, but deep down, I know what I saw. Those weren't fake footprints. They weren't made by any animal I know of. They were barefoot human prints, just 3 times the normal size, and whatever left them was intelligent enough to know what a trail camera was and how to disable it without damaging it. I'm back at my parents' place for summer break now. Yesterday, I went hiking in those same woods. Everything looks different in the summer, green and alive and normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And when I reached that same clearing where I'd found my camera turned around, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bark on several trees at about 8 feet high had been stripped away, not by disease or lightning, but in clean, deliberate strokes, like something had been marking its territory. I don't go into those woods alone anymore.